I'm Jeremy Fernandez.
And I'm Patricia Carvelis. Welcome to this ABC News Budget Special.
In less than a minute, the Treasurer will deliver his second budget. And here's the challenge he's facing. With Australians feeling the pain of the rising cost of living, Jim Chalmers doesn't want to make the inflation problem any worse. But he's also under growing pressure tonight to deliver hip pocket relief, particularly for the most vulnerable.
There will be some good news delivered tonight. Government coffers are awash with billions in extra revenue thanks to a stronger jobs market and high commodity prices.
But we're told it's only a short-term sugar hit. The longer-term structural problems remain. Spending is growing across a raft of areas, and the economic outlook both here and abroad isn't exactly rosy. Later, David Spears will bring you the first broadcast interview with the Treasurer, Jim Chalmers.
That's right. As soon as the Treasurer has delivered his budget address, he'll head here to the ABC studio in Parliament House. Budgets are all about priorities, and we'll examine the choices the government's made as it tries to offer some help for those struggling without making the economic and budget situation any worse. That's coming up. For now, we'll take you live to the Treasurer, Jim Chalmers.
I present the Appropriation Bill number 1, 2023-24 and the explanatory memorandum.
I call the clerk.
First reading, a bill for an act to appropriate money out of the Consolidated Revenue Fund for the ordinary annual services of the government and for related purposes.
And I give the call to the Treasurer.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I move that the bill be now read a second time. Speaker, we acknowledge the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people, the Yagara and the Yugambeh country around Logan, and all the First Nations of Australia, their elders, customs and traditions. And we recognise the opportunity that we have this year to move forward together, listening to each other in a spirit of unity and respect. Mr Speaker, the budget we present to the Australian people tonight provides cost of living relief that is responsible and affordable and prioritises those most in need. It delivers historic investments in Medicare and the care economy, making it easier and cheaper for Australians to see their doctor. It broadens opportunity by breaking down the barriers of disadvantage and exclusion. It lays the foundations for growth by embracing clean energy and investing in value-adding industries, people, skills, technology and small business. And it strengthens the budget with a surplus forecast for this year with less debt than smaller deficits compared with recent budgets. These are the foundations on which our government is building a stronger economy and a fairer society, with greater security in a time of economic uncertainty, more opportunities in more parts of our country, and a renewed determination for Australia to make the most of the defining decade ahead. Speaker, in all of our decisions, we seek to strike a considered, methodical balance between spending restraint to keep the pressure off inflation while doing what we can to help people struggling to make ends meet, making sure that vital services like Medicare and the National Disability Insurance Scheme are secure and reliable and sustainable, and dealing with immediate near-term challenges while investing in our long-term national economic success, seeing our people through the hard times and setting our country up for a better future. Mr Speaker, the global economy is slowing due to persistent inflation, higher interest rates and financial sector strains. Outside of the pandemic and the global financial crisis, the next 2 years are expected to be the weakest for global growth in over 2 decades, and this will affect us here in Australia. Our economic growth is expected to slow from 3.25% this year to 1.5% next year before recovering to 2.25% the one after. Despite this, our economy will continue to create jobs and unemployment is expected to remain low by historical standards, 4.25% in 23-24, 4.5% the year after. And in this environment, inflation remains our primary economic challenge. It drives rate rises and it erodes real wages, which is why this budget is carefully calibrated to alleviate inflationary pressures, not add to them. Our policies to ease the pressure on households will take 3/4 of a percentage point off inflation in 23-24, which is expected to fall from 6% this year to 3.25% next year, returning to the Reserve Bank's target band in 2024-25. Still higher than we'd like, for longer than we'd like, but tracking in the right direction. So while Australia may have a lot coming at us, we have a lot going for us as well. High prices for the things we sell overseas, a strong, well-regulated, secure banking system, low unemployment, and welcome signs that after a decade of being kept deliberately low, wages are moving again. Yeah. Wages growth for 2023-24 is now forecast to be 4%, up 1/4 percentage point from what was expected in October. This combination of lower than expected inflation and higher wages means that an earlier and stronger return to real wages growth is forecast for 2023-24. Speaker, at the same time, we understand that Australians are under the pump right now, and that's why providing responsible, targeted relief is the #1 priority in this budget. Our $14.6 billion cost of living plan will provide help with power bills, bring down out-of-pocket health costs, support vulnerable Australians, create more affordable housing and boost wages. Speaker, back in November, gas bills were set to go up by 20% in 23-24 and electricity bills were set to rise by 36%. Now, this was the high price Australians were slated to pay for the Russian invasion of Ukraine and a decade of energy policy failure here at home. Our government refused to stand by and let this happen. We took urgent and targeted action to place a cap on coal and gas prices, and tonight we are delivering up to $3 billion in direct energy bill relief for eligible households and small businesses, co-funded with the states and territories. More than 5 million households will have up to $500 deducted from their power bills in the next financial year. Real relief, right off your power bill, right when you need it. And because of our policies, electricity price increases are expected to be around 25 percentage points less than what was projected, and 16 percentage points less for gas. And a big part of making sure that energy bills are more affordable into the future is improving the energy efficiency of Australian homes, and not just new builds. Through this budget, we are investing $1 billion to help provide low-cost loans for double glazing and solar panels and other improvements that will make homes easier and cheaper to keep cool in summer and warm in winter. A common-sense program that will help family budgets and reduce emissions. Speaker, our first budget capped the price of medicines on the Pharmaceutical Benefits Scheme for around 3.6 million Australians, so that most now pay no more than $30 for the medicines that they need. In our second budget, we're investing $2.2 billion to increase access to life-changing medicines through the PBS. And from September this year, patients will be able to get more of the medicine they need for less money and less hassle. Instead of having to go back to their pharmacist every month, many people with common chronic illnesses will be able to get 2 months' worth of treatment for over 300 different medicines. This change will save people up to $180 a year, and for millions of Australians, the cost of medicines will be cut in half. Speaker, our government is proud that in our first year in office, 339,000 new jobs have been created. But even with unemployment at historic lows, we know there are still people struggling to find work and struggling to get by. The pressures on the budget are acute, but as a Labor government, we will always strive to help those who need it the most. That's why tonight we announce a $40 per fortnight increase for JobSeeker recipients, plus those on youth allowance, Austudy and other income support payments, helping to deliver a much-needed $4.9 billion boost in support to around 1.1 million Australians looking for work, studying or doing apprenticeships. And we are going further to help the single biggest group of Australians on JobSeeker, those aged 55 and over. Until now, people aged 60 and over and on payments for a long time have received a higher rate in recognition of the additional barriers that they face finding work. But the truth is, it gets more difficult earlier than that. The majority of people aged 55 and over on JobSeeker are women, many with little to no savings or superannuation, and who are at risk of homelessness. So tonight we're extending the extra support for those aged 60 and over to include Australians 55 and over. Yeah. More help for some of the most vulnerable people in our community. And in the same spirit, we're expanding parenting payments single, so it will now be available to single parents until their youngest child turns 14 rather than 8. Yeah. This will provide 57,000 families with an extra $176.90 per fortnight. Over 90% of these parents are single mums. They deserve our respect and our support for the incredible job that they do. Yeah. Speaker, for too long, secure, affordable housing has been out of reach for too many Australians. Tonight, to help ease the pressure on people feeling the pain of rising rents, we are increasing the maximum rates of Commonwealth rent assistance by 15%. This will provide up to $31 extra a fortnight for people renting in the private market and community housing, the largest increase in more than 30 years. But we know an essential part of the solution to pressures in the housing market is more homes for Australians. Our housing accord aims to build 1 million new well-located homes over 5 years from 2024. We're going to help drive this with a new tax break for build-to-rent projects, cutting the Managed Investment Trust withholding tax from 30 to 15%. And by increasing the liability cap of the National Housing Finance and Investment Corporation by $2 billion to support more lending to community housing providers. We want more Australians to know the security of a roof over their head, which is why we're also working with the states and territories to improve planning, to build more houses and to deliver a better deal for renters. For this same reason, implementation of the $10 billion Housing Australia Future Fund is critical to build more of the social and affordable houses that our people need. Speaker, our government came to office promising to get wages moving again. They're now growing at their fastest rate since 2012. And let's be clear, when it comes to the cost of living, fair wages for workers are not the problem, they're part of the solution. Yeah. Meaningful and sustainable wages growth is a fundamental feature of an economy that rewards people for their hard work. Meaningful and sustainable wages growth is why we've consistently advocated for low-paid Australians so they don't go backwards. The Prime Minister has said it many times, the heroes of the pandemic deserve more than our thanks. They deserve fair pay for their vital work. I'm proud that our budget provides $11.3 billion to fund a 15% increase in award wages for more than 250,000 aged care workers. Yeah. This pay rise will help retain, reward and recruit the hard-working people who care for our loved ones as they grow old. And the message from our government to the aged care workers of Australia is very simple. You deserve every cent. Yeah. Speaker, one of the things that makes this the best country in the world is our shared belief that every Australian should be able to access affordable, reliable healthcare. But right now, too many are finding it more and more difficult to see a doctor. The costs are too high, the wait times are too long, and the consultation is often too short. Families are being forced into a lose-lose choice between getting the help they need or paying their other bills. This robs parents of peace of mind and it puts families under strain. It means more problems go undiagnosed or untreated. And it means our workforce is not as healthy or productive as it could be and should be. And we want to change that. With new funding to build 8 more of our urgent care clinics so people in regional communities and growing suburbs can see a GP. A further $445 million to enable doctors, nurses and allied health professionals to cooperate for better care. Changes that will make it easier for Australians to get essential services at their pharmacy, like vaccinations. And tonight, Mr Speaker, I am proud to announce, as a centrepiece of this budget, our Labor government will triple the bulk billing incentive. This is the biggest increase to the incentive ever, delivering a $3.5 billion boost that will help GPs provide free consultations to around 11.6 million eligible Australians, including children, pensioners and other concession card holders. All of this will help take pressure off our public hospitals and emergency departments still feeling the strain of a once-in-a-century pandemic. And it will ensure that for millions of people, the quality of your health care is guaranteed not by your credit card, but by your Medicare card. Speaker, investing in Medicare, helping with the costs of energy and housing and supporting people most in need are all essential measures to assist Australians under pressure. But we know the best long-term guarantee of rising living standards and stronger wages and a better quality of life is a growing and productive economy. That's why our budget is underpinned by a plan to modernise our economy and maximise our strengths by making Australia a renewable energy superpower with strong strategic industries in global supply chains, investing in our people and their skills and supporting small businesses to innovate and grow. Speaker, Australia's biggest opportunity for growth and prosperity is the global shift to clean energy. By acting now, our resources, our researchers and our regions can help power the world. That's why in tonight's budget we are investing $2 billion in a new Hydrogen Head Start program so Australia can be a world leader in producing and exporting hydrogen power, while reducing our emissions in heavy industry here at home. Hydrogen power means Wollongong, Gladstone and Whyalla can make and export everything from renewable energy to green steel. Seizing these kinds of industrial and economic opportunities will be the biggest driver and determinant of our future prosperity. The government is making the biggest ever investment in Australia's energy transformation. This budget allocates $4 billion to realising our future as a renewable energy superpower, bringing the government's total investment to more than $40 billion. This includes part of our $15 billion National Reconstruction Fund to support the development of green industries, manufacturing and more, and a new capacity investment scheme that will unlock over $10 billion of investment in firmed-up renewable energy projects up and down our East Coast. These strategic investments will work in partnership. Abundant, affordable, renewable energy powering new jobs and new industries in our regions and our suburbs, while our safeguard mechanism will encourage business to invest in the path to net zero. To realise this vision, we're making targeted investments in green industries, as well as technology and other value-adding areas, including a new Powering Australia Industry Growth Centre to help Australian businesses manufacture renewable technologies, funding to support the growth of quantum and AI, plus $286 million of investment in our creative sector. This will create new opportunities right across our economy, and so will our historic and vital investment in defence and national security. The AUKUS agreement will directly support 20,000 high-skill, high-wage jobs over the next 30 years in advanced manufacturing and broaden and deepen our industrial base. To make sure all of these jobs and opportunities extend to every part of our country, we're investing $3.7 billion for a revamped 5-year national skills agreement with the states and territories. And we're creating 300,000 fee-free TAFE places to train Australians in critical and emerging sectors. We're expanding access to foundational skills so that all Australians aged over 15 can develop the language, numeracy and digital skills that they need. And we're encouraging more women into apprenticeships through a new Australian Skills Guarantee. Speaker, in this budget we also back Australian small business with a $20,000 instant asset write-off, a new small business energy incentive to support investments in power-saving assets, and new help for small businesses to adopt and adapt to digital technology. Speaker, we are the first government in Australia's history with a majority of women in our ranks. And as the And as the Finance Minister and the Minister for Women often says, we know equality for women is not an add-on, it's not a nice-to-have, it's absolutely crucial for our prosperity. That's why we've taken action to close the gender pay gap, introduced 10 days of paid family and domestic violence leave, made gender equity an objective of the Fair Work Act and put a new focus on workers in the care economy. And on 1 July, Australians will begin to benefit from cheaper early childhood education and enhanced paid parental leave. And tonight we build on this work by dedicating almost $590 million to the National Plan to End Violence Against Women and Children, and investing $72.4 million to retain and recruit more early childhood educators, and by abolishing the punitive Parents Next program while getting on with designing a voluntary system that genuinely supports mothers preparing for work. Speaker, alongside financial support for Australians in need, we're also investing in new programs to tackle entrenched disadvantage, putting our trust in the knowledge and passion of locals to break the chains of intergenerational poverty. I see it in my own community, library programs unlocking the world of learning, sporting clubs building pride, community groups mentoring young people into apprenticeships, breakthroughs and progress driven by locals and leaders. And tonight we back their hard work with a $200 million plan which includes funding place-based partnerships, encouraging evidence-based policy directed at a local level, investment in projects that are delivering measurable success, a new partnership that will help government and philanthropy to coordinate their efforts. And in addition, more funding for community organisations so that they can pay their bills and pay their workers and keep delivering for people in need. This will sit alongside $1.9 billion for First Nations health, housing, education, employment and other essential services, and $250 million for a new Central Australia package to improve safety and provide more opportunities for more people in their communities. Speaker, from energy bill relief to national defence, manufacturing to Medicare, investments in this budget aim to make Australia more resilient and more secure in uncertain times. And fundamental to this is our responsible economic management and our efforts to put the budget on a much stronger foundation. This budget, we've returned 82% of the extra revenue windfall that's come largely from lower unemployment, stronger jobs and wages growth, and higher prices for key exports. We've now returned 87% over this budget and the last. We've also found $17.8 billion in savings and redirected spending, $40 billion over 2 budgets. And we've limited annual real spending growth to just 0.6% over 5 years. Because our first 2 budgets made such a firm commitment to responsibility and restraint, we are now forecasting a small surplus in 2022-23, which would be the first in 15 years. We expect that to be followed by a deficit of $13.9 billion in 23-24 and lower deficits across the forward years compared to recent budgets, leading to a $125.9 billion improvement in the budget over 5 years and a much lower public debt burden. Gross debt to GDP is now expected to peak lower and earlier at 36.5% of GDP in 25-26, where it will be $154 billion less than was expected in March 2022. And because we're returning most of the welcome improvement in revenue to the budget, debt will be almost $300 billion lower by the end of the medium term, saving $83 billion in interest costs over the next 12 years. Speaker, we are expecting one of the biggest turnarounds on record, while dealing with a whole host of programs and services which were left without ongoing funding. In October, this meant an additional $4.1 billion in spending. In May, we've had to find another $7.5 billion, including $1.5 billion for legacy health funding and to make sure that Australians retain access to their My Health record, and more than $800 million to sustainably fund our biosecurity system to keep our farmers and producers secure. Speaker, our government is building a strong, sustainable care economy that works for carers and for the people they care for, which is why we're extending disability support programs and investing in additional home care packages. We're upholding the security of our nation and the stability of our region, which is why we're implementing the recommendations of the Defence Strategic Review and allocating $1.9 billion to strengthening our relationships in the Pacific. And we're supporting those who have served and sacrificed, which is why we're spending $64.1 million to continue eliminating the claims backlog so that veterans get faster access to the support that they need and deserve. Speaker, beyond the immediate pressures on our budget, there are genuine structural challenges facing us into the future: defence, health, aged care, the NDIS and interest payments on debt. Tonight we're putting in place some modest but meaningful revenue measures to help address this, like tightening superannuation tax concessions for those with balances exceeding $3 million, a 15% global and domestic minimum tax for large multinational companies, changes to the petroleum resource rent tax so that Australians receive a fairer return on the sale of our natural resources sooner, raising the tax on tobacco by 5% for 3 years and extending tax compliance programs. But the inescapable truth is that the federal government cannot put all the services that Australians expect and deserve on a more sustainable footing just by ourselves. That's why the Prime Minister has brought together the states and territories to agree on a new cooperative approach, so we can secure the future of essential services and programs that both levels of government support, and so we can make sure that the NDIS continues to provide life-changing outcomes for future generations of Australians with a disability. Under Labor, the NDIS is here to stay. We are determined to make sure every dollar counts and every dollar goes to improving the lives of the participants the scheme was established for. Our changes are designed to put the interests of participants first as we cooperate to moderate the growth in costs. It took a Labor government to create the NDIS, and this Labor government will secure its future. Speaker, 122 years ago today, this federal parliament first met, called to serve a new nation on an ancient continent created by a vote of the people. Today, Australia is bigger, fairer, more diverse, more open to the world and more engaged with our region than anyone alive at Federation could possibly have imagined. And yet what brought this country together was a belief that the future could belong to Australia and that we would be stronger and safer and more prosperous if we worked together to seize its opportunities and share its rewards. A commonwealth of common purpose. And that optimism and resilience has sustained us and carried us through downturns and disaster, through recession and pandemic. And the belief in opportunity fairly shared has underpinned our greatest achievements, from Medicare to superannuation. The same spirit underpins constitutional recognition through a voice. It drives our government and it shapes this budget. A determination to tackle the big challenges and to seize the big chances. A deep faith in our people, their skills, their smarts, their innovation and their aspiration. This tonight is a plan for security, for prosperity, for growth. It's an economic strategy to help with cost of living pressures now and to maximise and extend the opportunities of the future to more of our people in more parts of our country in the defining, decisive decade ahead. And so, Mr Speaker, for all of these reasons, I commend this bill and this budget to the House.
Hello and welcome back to our special budget coverage. I'm Patricia Karvelis. That was the Treasurer, Jim Chalmers, delivering his second budget and the first surplus in 15 years. Jim Chalmers is the first Labor Treasurer since Paul Keating in 1988-89 to achieve what seemed unachievable not that long ago. Now, in a moment, David Spears will interview the Treasurer, Jim Chalmers, and later you'll hear reaction from the Shadow Treasurer, Angus Taylor, and I'll interview the Greens leader, Adam Bandt. Jeremy Fernandez has gone into the halls of Parliament House, where he'll bring you analysis from a team of budget experts over the course of the next hour.
That's right, PK. In a moment, we'll bring you reaction from two of the country's top economists, Chris Richardson and Danielle Wood. They'll help break down the numbers you need to know. We'll also look at the major cost of living measures announced tonight and ask if they go far enough. I'll be joined by the Parenthood's Georgie Dent and Anglicare's Casey Chambers, along with Triple J Hacks' Shalila Medora. But first, here's political reporter Noor Hayder to run you through the key elements of tonight's budget.
Hi everyone.
The suit, the books and their numbers all tell the story, out of the blue and into the black.
We're really proud of this budget.
Second time around, Jim Chalmers is armed with a surprise slender surplus, thanks to surging revenue, much saved, some spent so as to not stoke inflation.
And are you confident that this additional spending won't actually make matters worse?
This budget has been very carefully calibrated to address the cost of living challenges in our economy.
To be precise, a $14 billion package. To help take the sting out of winter power bills, the budget includes $1.5 billion worth of federal energy bill relief. In a deal struck with states, more than 5 million low-income households will be eligible for subsidies, shaving up to $500 off their energy bills. For up to 1 million small businesses, that figure can grow to up to $650.
Take a deeper breath for me, please.
Seeing the doctor will be cheaper for more than 11.5 million people. $3.5 billion will go towards expanding free bulk bill GP visits for children aged under 16, pensioners and Commonwealth concession card holders.
That's an important cost. Anyone who's had kids and had to take them to the doctors knows that.
After a long campaign for a substantial increase to the JobSeeker payment, a modest lift is on the way. JobSeeker Youth Allowance and AusStudy will increase by $40 per fortnight, or $2.80 a day, while more older Australians without a job will become eligible for a higher JobSeeker rate at 55 years of age instead of 60. Single parents will be able to claim the single parenting payment until their youngest child turns 14. That's up from 8. A $1.9 billion investment estimated to help 52,000 single mums currently receiving the lower rate JobSeeker. As the rental crisis deepens, some Australians will get extra support. Tonight, Labor confirming the maximum rate of Commonwealth rent assistance will be lifted by 15%, worth just under $3 billion over 5 years. That's a $31 fortnightly increase in support for low-income renters. Higher income tax from record employment and booming commodity prices have gifted government coffers a temporary boost. Compared to where he thought he'd be back in October, the Treasurer's had a $40 billion turnaround to a surplus due in June. But it'll be short-lived. This budget forecasts an immediate slide back into the red, then staying there for the next 3 years. It's not all revenue gain without pain. The tax take is going up on gas exports, multinational companies and those who evade the GST. The worst of inflation is now behind us, but lingering on for another 2 years. The government insists its spending will not make the cost of living crisis worse, and energy bill relief will in fact bring inflation down. Even if this budget does its bit to tackle that problem, it leaves for later years the big gulf between rising ongoing costs and more regular levels of revenue.
Nobody here, not Katie or I or anyone in the Cabinet, pretends that it is mission accomplished when it comes to putting the budget on a much more sustainable footing.
That falls to him next year.
Noor Haider reporting there. I'm joined now by the ABC's political editor, Andrew Probyn. Andrew Probyn, this is the first surplus in 15 years, an extraordinary moment really for the country. Is this a big win for Labor?
Definitely. This is an astonishing return to black. Once again, it's shown that Vladimir Putin's invasion of Ukraine is actually serving Treasury coffers in Australia very, very well. But aside from the budget surplus, we're looking at what Labor claims to be lowering of the inflationary pressures on the economy, plus $15 billion worth of cost of living relief. If it can deliver all three, then that's a big thing. But I think, though, that the budget surplus had a bit of political inconvenience to it for Jim Chalmers, who has had a lot of demands thrown at him. And perhaps we're seeing a bigger cost of living relief than he might have otherwise have planned.
That's interesting. How do you see the political contest over the next period of time?
Well, I think it is going to be back where it was before the budget, and that's the focus on inflation. The opposition will claim that government spending is causing inflation in the first instance. The government will argue the opposite. In the longer term, however, the argument is going to be about where the revenue is coming from, because what this budget doesn't answer is how do we pay for big increases in defence, aged care, National Disability Insurance Scheme. These are big costs. That revenue question has not been answered, and it's a much, much more difficult case to be had, and it's going to take a lot more courage than slugging oil and gas companies and hitting smokers.
Yeah, and the Treasurer certainly says he wants to keep having that conversation. Thank you, Andrew. Andrew Probyn there. And we're going to hear more of Andrew Probyn's analysis later as part of the Insiders Budget Special with David Spears. Let's head back to Jeremy Fernandez now. He's with two of the country's leading economists.
I am indeed, PK. I'm joined by Chris Richardson from Rich Insight and the Grattan Institute's Danielle Wood. Welcome to both of you. Chris, how much credit can this government, or indeed the previous government, take for this surplus?
Not much at all. This is not happening because of any decision of any government. It's war and inflation. They're terrible, but they turn out to be great for the budget. The lucky country, very lucky with its budget. Surplus now, I'm not even going to be surprised if it's a surplus next year as well. Skinnier deficits, lower debt, and certainly on the official figures, the long-term budgetary challenge looks magically lots lower than it looked just a handful of months ago.
Let's talk about that fiscal forecast, Danielle Wood. How accurate and reliable are the government's figures?
Look, I think in the short term, they're not too bad. They've been less conservative than they were previously on commodity prices. Still pretty conservative, that said. But it is those 10-year medium-term forecasts that Chris was just talking about where I think the numbers look particularly optimistic. There is some reason to think the structural deficit has shrunk over the decade. Interest payments are lower, the economy has grown faster, but 60 billion of that improvement relies on lower growth in the NDIS. There was no policies in the budget tonight to tell us how they were going to achieve that. It also relies on incredible containment of costs in areas like hospitals and other parts of the budget. So I'm much less sanguine about the the longer term outlook than the budget tonight was.
Chris, the government's making a big play on cost of living relief, so energy, housing, childcare, just to name a few. And the Treasurer says this will not be inflationary. Now, is Philip Lowe of the RBA going to agree with him?
I don't think so. Now, to be clear, lots of the spending the government is doing is the right thing to do. The temporary stuff around more vulnerable Australians, the longer term stuff, the increase in JobKeeper, absolutely, and it's not enough. That's all great. But if you really wanted to do all that fairness stuff and at the same time keep the Reserve Bank on the bench, I'd say you needed to take some tough decisions, and we haven't, by and large, seen those tough decisions in this budget. The budget does inject extra money into the economy that will be spent. I had thought, after the surprise rate rise from the Reserve Bank last month, that they were done and dusted. I'm less clear now that that's the case.
How quickly would the Reserve Bank look to react?
To be fair, it will take time. Government spending takes time to work its way through the economy. But this is a fair amount of extra money going into an economy with an existing inflation problem. They're going to look at this pretty closely.
Danielle, longer term, we have this structural issue where we're, to put it simply, spending more than we bring in. Has the government done enough to raise revenue rather than just spending modestly and just saving a few dollars here and there?
There are some revenue measures in the budget tonight, about $22 billion worth over the forwards. The government's referred to them as modest but meaningful. I would probably refer to them as, hitting people that aren't going to get much sympathy in public. So, there's a modest increase in taxes from gas producers making windfall profits, more taxes on superannuants with very high balances, smokers, more on multinationals. So I think they are, in the future, given those structural problems, they are going to have to go further, and that will mean actually looking at tax increases that hit a broader group of people.
And going further means politically difficult decisions, right?
Exactly right. So, I don't think the question about the stage 3 tax cuts is going to go away. I believe they should be trimmed, not totally eliminated. We do need to compensate for bracket creep, but they are a very big hit to the budget. I think there's broader questions around the sustainability of certain tax concessions, things like the capital gains tax discount, things like the minimisation opportunities available through family trusts. Those all, I think... GST. If we want to talk broader tax reform, I think that's a really live question. All of those, I think, are going to have to be in the mix going forward.
The WA GST deal too, that certainly appears to be on the table, certainly for a lot of West Australians watching.
Look, at the moment, that is costing the Commonwealth budget close to $6 billion a year. That is to compensate the other states for the revenue they would have lost because of that special deal with WA. That is a big budget impact. And I think it's actually pretty hard to justify.
Chris, just briefly, commodity prices are still forecast to hit a bit of a speed bump over the next 4 quarters. Will they come true?
So Treasury has this big hollow log. It keeps saying that the price of stuff that Australia sells to the world, like iron ore, will fall fast. They're now saying not quite as fast as before. But Treasury is not the government's official commodity price forecaster. The industry department is. If you plug in the forecast the industry department released just a month ago into this budget, my estimate would be it turns the coming year into a surplus as well. Treasury still has a hollow log. I'm sure it's worried about ongoing defence costs. It's worried about how could you turn the promise about doing something into the NDIS into actual policy. It's keeping a little bit of powder dry.
All right, Chris Richardson, Danielle Wood, great to talk to you both. Thank you.
Thank you.
Let's take you now to David Spears with the Treasurer, Jim Chalmers.
Treasurer, thanks for joining us, and thank you for rushing up from the House of Reps chamber to be with us. Look, as you said tonight in the speech, inflation is the primary challenge confronting the economy and certainly households as well. Your budget tonight pumps more than $20 billion into the economy, most of that in just the coming year. Are you making the Reserve Bank's job harder?
Oh, absolutely not. We're making the job of the Independent Reserve Bank easier by taking seriously this inflation challenge. big investments in the supply side of the economy, responsible economic management, banking 82% of the upward revision to revenue, and also making sure that our cost of living package is delivered over time in the most responsible way. And the reason why there's some spending in 23-24, frankly, is because there are a whole bunch of unfunded ongoing programs that we had to fund, some COVID liabilities as well, the structure of our small business package, and a little bit of the cost of living package is in 23-24.
But the point is that you need to offset that extra spending to avoid impacting inflation. I mean, as I say, it's a $12 billion net increase in the coming year, more than $20 billion over the 4 years. Just explain to me how that's not putting more money into the economy and pushing up inflation.
Well, it partly depends on how you spend it, not just the magnitude of the spend, but the quality of the spend. But I invite you to look at the budget in its entirety. You know, this is an historic turnaround in the budget, which wouldn't be possible were it not for the historic restraint that we've shown in banking, 82% of the upward revision in revenue, 87% over two budgets. We wouldn't
but
be
still spending more.
But we wouldn't be within QE of a forecast surplus this year were it not for the responsible economic management that we've shown. Now, it is necessary.
And I'm not arguing that. I'm just pointing to the extra spending that you're putting into the economy.
And I've explained that some of that is unavoidable legacy spending left to us by our predecessors, unfunded ongoing programs.
A lot of this is your cost of living package.
Some of it is the cost of living package, but in areas, for example, energy bill relief, which will put downward pressure on the inflation forecast because it makes people's bills lower than they would otherwise be. The combination of our gas and coal caps with our energy bill relief is expected to take 0.75% off the inflation forecast.
But the other
next
changes
year.
on job seeker, rent assistance, the GP bulk billing incentive, all of these things, can you give any sort of guarantee that this all won't lead to higher interest rates?
Well, I don't speak on behalf of the Reserve Bank Governor, but at every step of this budget, the remarkable restraint we've shown, the investments in the supply side of the economy and the way we've targeted and staged our cost of living package, all of that is because inflation is the biggest challenge in our economy. This budget has been carefully calibrated and carefully designed to take the pressure off the cost of living, not add to inflation.
So 5 million households and 1 million small businesses will receive this energy bill relief. Who's eligible and who's not?
Well, the eligibility differs a little bit because we've had to do 8 deals with 8 different states and territories, but largely people on pensions and payments, people who are already eligible for state programs, in addition to, depending on the state and territory, others, for example, people on family payments. But one of the reasons why it's taken us a little while to get it together is because we've had to do these deals. The amounts are different depending on price pressures, depending on the state programs. Delivery is a little bit different. But more than 5 million people will get up to $500 off their electricity bill, their winter electricity bill, and that will make a difference.
But you have to be on one of these payments to receive the help?
The eligibility is a little bit different around the states and territories, but largely it's people on pensions and payments.
Does your power company have to know that you're on one of those payments, or know what your income is?
Yeah, we work closely with the retailers to make sure. Yeah, we make sure that this relief is provided on the bill, rather than spraying around cash cheques to people. We do it at the bill level. That gets the price of electricity lower than it would otherwise be. It means working with the retailers and working with the states and territories.
Your budget does still suggest, though, that we will see further increases in electricity prices of, I think, more than 10% in the coming year.
It was going to be 36%, David.
So
the forecast was 36%.
They're still going up, is the point for a lot of people struggling at the moment.
David.
Well, they are going up.
But David, as a consequence of our policies, we've taken an electricity price rise that was going to be 36% and we've made it 10%. We've taken 25 or more, when you count for rounding, of the percentage points off the projected electricity price increase.
So my question is, when will we start to see those electricity prices fall?
Well, in the current budget, we only forecast in this budget 1 year ahead, and that's the 10% number that you are mentioning. There aren't forecasts beyond that for good reasons, but these electricity prices are much lower than they would otherwise be because of the combination of the energy plan that we put in place, the gas and coal caps, and the energy bill relief.
So you're not sure when they'll start to fall?
Well, the budget doesn't forecast beyond this year. The forecast was 36, now it's 10. That says to me that our policy is working.
The big new measure tonight is this effort to make going to the doctor more affordable. You're tripling the bulk billing incentive for GPs. How many more doctors are likely to bulk bill as a result?
Well, what we're expecting is something like 11.6 million Australians will be able to access this really quite historic achievement, investment in Medicare in the budget tonight. $3.5 billion, a bigger program, more than $5 billion to strengthen Medicare. Obviously, our intention there is to try and get more doctors incentivised to stay bulk billing. Too many people can't find a bulk billing doctor.
Let's look at those really struggling, those on job seeker, those on unemployment benefits. The government, the Morrison government actually gave them an extra $50 a fortnight. You've decided to give them an extra $40 a fortnight, just under $3 a day. It is well short of what was recommended by your Economic Inclusion Advisory Committee. Why is that?
Well, we've done what we can afford in this budget. We've tried to be as responsible as we can, recognising that people on job seeker are doing it particularly tough.
Why is this figure responsible? Just explain to me why you've landed here.
Well, we have to strike a series of fine balances. And we understand that there will be people who are saying $40 a fortnight is not enough. There'll be some who'll be saying it's too much.
So
frankly.
why do you think this is the right balance?
Well, we think we've struck the right balance between what we can afford and taking into consideration all of the economic pressures in the economy, as you and I were discussing a moment ago. We think we've landed on.
So you can't afford anymore. Is that the issue?
Well, largely, but also the $40 a fortnight. Some people on job seeker will also be able to access the energy bill relief. They'll also be able to access the Commonwealth rent assistance. So I'd encourage your viewers not to just see one of these payments in isolation.
The rent assistance, an extra 15%. What assurance can you give that landlords won't simply bump up the rents they're charging as a result?
Well, the reason that rents are going up in this country are not because people are getting too much Commonwealth rent assistance. The rents are going up because we've got vacancies too low and rents are too high, and that's because we don't have enough homes. And we're trying to build more homes, more affordable rental properties. There's a new tax break for build to rent, and we're trying to get our Housing Australia Future Fund through the Parliament. But as well as that, we're trying to take some of the sting out of these rent rises as well, and that's why the biggest Commonwealth rent assistance increase in, I think, 30 years or so, we hope will make a bit of a difference.
Why are you giving politicians $159 million for more electorate staff and travel?
Oh, this is in recognition of the really quite extraordinary workload that the officers are under. I think we've seen some recent well-publicised court cases, for example, which go to how hard our staff work. So this is a response to that? Well, not entirely, but I think that really shone a light on some of the issues.
A lot of people are doing it tough, though. How do you think they'll feel about pollies getting...
Well, it's about serving the community better. It's about serving the community better and taking some of the pressure off people who are working around the clock to serve the community, I think is a good thing.
Hydrogen. You're putting $2 billion into a new program called Hydrogen Head Start. Andrew Forrest has been lobbying for something like this. Is he potentially one of the biggest winners of this budget?
Oh, well, I don't want to preempt who will receive these production credits. There'll be a competitive process when the scheme is designed and up and running, and it's all about encouraging more hydrogen production. I think this is the big opportunity for Australia to get a bigger slice of the action in the global transformation, net zero transformation. This is a big part of our plan to grow the economy. Hydrogen is going to be key to our future. And so this $2 billion hydrogen head start is all about incentivising that.
Treasurer, you're set to post a small surplus, the first in 15 years, but it is short-lived. We then go back into deficits over the coming 4 years, more than $100 billion worth of deficits. Have you missed an opportunity here to make some bolder decisions on things like capital gains tax, trusts, the stage 3 tax cuts, the sort of things that Danielle Wood and Chris Richardson we saw there have been urging you to do?
Well, we've got a tax reform program in this budget, which is a meaningful one. PRRT, multinationals, high superannuation balances,
it's obviously not
tobacco
enough,
tax.
To fix this structural deficit.
Well, I think it's ambitious and I think it's meaningful and make a difference to the structural position of the budget. I mean,
so those other ideas, are they too politically risky?
Well, frankly, I'm a little surprised because no government that I can remember has made such a big difference to the structural position of the budget than we did tonight. We banked that upward revenue surge. We had tax reform. And we found,
these economists are making it's not enough. And the figures show that.
And we found $18 billion of savings. You know how many savings were in Josh Frydenberg's last budget? $0.
You're here now, though, Treasurer.
Yeah, and $40 billion over 2 budgets, remarkable spending restraint,
so will you return to
meaningful tax reform, has improved the structural position of the budget and has let us forecast the first surplus in 15 years.
Could you return to some of these other ideas?
Well, I've just handed down the budget for tonight. You know, I'm not contemplating the May 2024 budget. I'm talking about tonight's budget. But honestly, I mean, I don't think any objective observer looking at what we've done tonight can conclude anything other than we have made substantial progress on repairing the budget, not as an end in itself, but so we can help people through difficult times and invest in their future.
Let's finally look longer term. Your budget does suggest that structural deficit over the coming 10 years will actually narrow. I've got a graph from your budget I just want to bring up here and get you to explain it for me. Total receipts, the orange line at the bottom there, you can see over the coming 10 years, that really starts to climb. Is that bracket creep that's lifting those tax revenues?
Oh, it is partly a consequence of people working more and earning more. That's even driving some of the near-term improvement as well. But the structural position is improved by a whole range of things. The changes that we're making to the budget mean that we're paying less interest on our debt. That's making a difference.
But if that graph is right, we'd be paying more tax as a percentage of GDP than we have for 50 years.
But that assumes no tax changes for 10 years. You know, that assumes... so
that won't happen?
Well, I don't know if I'll be here in 10 years' time to explain it to you,
budget,
David.
That's all. This is your budget.
I'm pleased that you put that graph up because I'm proud of the structural improvements that we made in the budget, but there is more work to do. There is a structural challenge in the budget that we've been addressing, but there is more work to do. But tonight we've made some substantial progress.
And finally, on that payments side, you do see it flatlining there over the coming 10 years. A lot of that has to do with interest payments on debt being lower.
Yeah.
But also the NDIS, this 8% target to limit the growth to 8% in the NDIS. It's meant to save $59 billion, I think, over the decade.
Yeah.
You haven't worked out how to do that yet?
Oh, well, already we've got, instead of the program blowing out by $17 billion, we found, or Bill Shorten found $15 billion of improvements even over the forward estimates. And so we've shown we want every dollar to go to the people who deserve our help and support. That's our overwhelming and overriding ambition here, to help people who need that support. That means moderating the growth in costs. We've made a start on that, and there's more of that to do in the medium term, working with the sector and the states and territories. It will still grow very quickly. 8% is a decent clip, and we want to look after people, but we've got to make sure it's sustainable.
Treasurer Jim Chalmers, really appreciate you joining us tonight. Thank you.
Thanks, David.
And that was David Spears with the first interview with the Treasurer Jim Chalmers. Some interesting moments in that interview. One of them was on the question of whether this budget puts pressure on inflation. Now, that's going to be one of the key charges of the opposition and perhaps others. On that question and whether the RBA's job becomes harder as a result of this budget, the Treasurer has told David Spears that, in fact, he's not making the RBA's job harder. In fact, he's making it easier. On energy prices, he talks about the 10% increase that's gone down because of the energy relief, but cannot say when energy prices start going down beyond that. He says that's not forecast. Some other moments too, like the increase in the job seeker payment, which has been delivered across the board. It was a lot of speculation about that. It is an across-the-board increase, but on why they didn't go further and actually deliver on the demands of the Economic Committee that asked for a bigger increase to the job seeker rate, the Treasurer conceded that largely it was because it was unaffordable. Some interesting comments too on politicians getting more staff, a little part of the budget, around $150 million. Jim Chalmers suggesting that after court cases, I think he's referring to that Sally Rugg court case that's just settled, that ultimately they had to intervene to try and help politicians when it comes to having staff and dealing with their electoral staff. A really interesting interview there with David Spears. Now, the forecast of a surplus for the current financial year doesn't just change the arithmetic, it also changes the political landscape dominated for so long by the rhetoric of deficits. The budget was a chance for the Treasurer to reset Labor's brand as economic managers, as 7:30's chief political correspondent Laura Tingle reports.
The debt truck on the road again.
Labor's debt and deficit disaster.
They've been on a spending spree, a spending like drunken sailors.
The helm is no place for the inexperienced.
No. People know Labor can't manage money. They come after yours.
Since the global financial crisis 15 years ago, the Coalition has attacked Labor relentlessly for presiding over budget deficits.
No, come on, I'll have that.
It became the prism through which every political issue was seen. A surplus was something only a coalition government could deliver, they said. until it became a rather less exclusive skill on the weekend.
Look, a drover's dog can deliver a budget surplus this year. We know that.
It's all that history that makes confirmation tonight that Labor will oversee the first surplus in 15 years so politically significant, even if at $4.2 billion, the size of the surplus might not seem much to write home about. It's not the size of the surplus that's important, though. It's the fact that tonight's budget really should mark an end for Labor enduring this particular line of political attack of wearing the opprobrium of being the lesser economic managers. The budget might only deliver one forecast surplus, but the overall picture it paints of the state of the government's books is of a budget that has returned to some sort of normal for the foreseeable future after the crises of the GFC and then of pandemic. Just last year, in the pre-election budget statement, the budget in 2022-23 was expected to be $78 billion in deficit, and the deficits were only forecast to fall to around $40 billion in 5 years' time. But as of tonight, there is a $4.2 billion surplus this year, and deficits remain a fraction of those earlier forecasts right out until 2026-27. A strong economy and booming resource prices, rather than spending cuts or tax increases, might be the reason for a $150 billion improvement in the budget's position since forecasts made just before last year's federal election. But Jim Chalmers' budget strategy is designed to lock in as much of that good fortune as possible, by banking a bit over 80% of the windfall and by constraining real growth in spending to just 0.6% of GDP for the next 5 years. That not only delivers a dividend to the budget, but a political dividend to Labor, weakening, though one suspects not ending, the Coalition's line of attack on Labor's economic management. But it also means the Albanese government will not be working in an environment where the budget feels like it is in post-pandemic crisis. There are still big spending pressures like the NDIS and defence to be dealt with down the track. But Labor has cleared away a lot of the detritus of recent years, both political and budgetary, and has more room to consider what it does next on both spending and tax. Starting the task of reining in the two fastest growing areas of spending, interest on debt and the NDIS, leaves room for the government to start delivering what the Prime Minister said yesterday
will be a Labor budget in every sense.
And the budget is a Labor budget. There's the obvious increase in welfare payments, not huge, but something, and the big win for single parents in being able to keep their higher rates of payments until their children are 14 instead of 8. But it sounded like the government was particularly proud of a less trumpeted but crucial $5.7 billion commitment over 5 years to improve Medicare, particularly through increasing incentive payments to GPs, to bulk bill concession card holders and children.
For parents with children under the age of 16, that's an important cost. Anyone who's had kids and had to take them to the doctors knows that, and often when one kid gets sick, the rest go down as well.
Once again, it's not just the dollars involved here, but the change in tone. The days of raiding the welfare budget and the sly sledging of welfare recipients seem to be over. Labor is trying to rewrite the rules for a more compassionate country. Overall, it's a budget that does a little bit for everyone, but particularly those doing it toughest. Against the backdrop of what still looks like a gloomy and fragile economic outlook, where growth in the coming year will be less than half of this year, and households will be spending just a fraction of this year's consumption. The budget papers acknowledge cost of living pressures and higher interest rates are now hitting household budgets hard. Wages will grow only slightly faster than inflation. By next year's budget, people will inevitably be starting to look to the next election, and the question of what the government does about the Stage 3 tax cuts or other tax changes will be unavoidable. The 2023 budget draws a picture of an economy which will hopefully be starting to rebound by this time next year, creating more room to further repair the social contract.
That was Laura Tingle. Let's head back now to Jeremy Fernandez.
Thanks, PK. I want to look closely now at the cost of living measures announced tonight. I'll soon be joined by Triple J Hacks Shalila Medora, Georgie Dent from The Parenthood and Casey Chambers from Anglicare for their reactions. But first, we know that students are among those going through a tough time right now. Before tonight, the highest rate that a single childless person on youth allowance could receive was around $14,600 a year. And that will now increase from September by around $1,000. Shalila spent some time with a university student last week to get a sense of how hard it is to live off the welfare payment.
Shalila?
Nice to meet you.
Lovely to meet you too. Come right in.
Thank you so much.
Sam Thomas is a 21-year-old visual arts and politics student at the Australian National University in Canberra. Sam lives in a share house with 4 others, and the walls are covered with their photos and artwork. But getting by on youth allowance and rent assistance means making art is on the back burner for now. Sam's struggling to afford even the most basic of items.
They're really at the end of their tether, and honestly, I don't know how I'm going to be able to buy new ones. The total amount of youth allowance and rent assistance that I receive is $600 per fortnight. I'm scared. I'm scared of the next rental increase. I'm already cutting down on the amount of food that I'm eating. I'm very scared of getting sick. I've already started getting sick, and I worry about what the rest of winter is going to be like. If I was kicked out, I would be homeless. I would be sleeping in my car.
Sam's already cutting corners to make ends meet, going down to just 2 meals a day.
Most of the food that I've got are kind of long-term staples. Most of it is from Food Bank.
Sam, like many students, relies on support from food banks like this one. The year from April 2022 to April 2023 had the highest rental increase on record, nearly 12% for the major cities, according to CoreLogic.
It's not fair. I have done the right things. I graduated high school, I got my HSC, and then I went to a big university to try and improve myself and improve my life.
Sam says failing to increase the rate of youth allowance and job seeker condemns people to a life of poverty.
The current rate causes poverty. It means that people fall into poverty and they find it far more difficult to actually get themselves back together on this low income than they would if they just had a bit more money, if they just had a bit more certainty, if they didn't have the government breathing down their neck all the time.
Now, Shalila, you've touched base with Sam tonight. What's their take?
Yeah, so Sam is broadly supportive of a lot of elements in this budget, particularly single parent payments, but they said that the increases are quite modest, and I want to read a little bit of their statement. They say, the payments are so modest they would only take me back to where I was 3 months ago. They do nothing to protect me against inflation. The increase in rent assistance barely covers the rent increase I received this year. If I lose my room, I will still not be able to find another one, and I will still be homeless.
So, Casey, that works out to $2.85 a day, that $40 a fortnight increase. How meaningful is that to someone who is living in poverty or close to it?
Look, I think anything is good. You know, this rate has been so low for so long, but it's going to be very difficult. We see people struggling with food, struggling with medications. It's really not keeping up. And when we look at this rate, it's not going to make a lot of difference in that big payment, the rent. You can't pay half your rent. You can't defer it for a week. It's not elastic. And so again, we see people like Sam who are cutting back on food, cutting back on the quality of food. So it's really good that it's in the conversation in this budget, and it's great that there's been a lot of work to try and get it into the front of people's thoughts, and what we need to be doing now is to committing to perhaps making it the centre of the next budget and to keep on with this rate, because it does actually put people into poverty instead of lifting them out.
To what extent then does the job seeker payment help people ultimately get back into work? That's the whole point, right?
It's very difficult. We spoke to a gentleman a couple of weeks ago who had $60 a fortnight left after he'd paid his rent. So now he's going to have $100 a fortnight. But what he was telling us was that after he paid heating bills, after he paid for food, let alone anything else, he could not afford to put credit on his mobile phone. He couldn't afford an internet connection, and he couldn't afford to catch public transport anywhere, which really are 3 of the fundamentals of looking for work, let alone the fact that often when you're fighting that hard for food, you've got to prioritise your time.
Shalila, job seeker allowances for over 60s are being extended now forward to over 55s. What do you think is the rationale about making those age distinctions where, look, a lot of people are feeling the cost of living burden equally.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there are some good reasons for that age group, particularly because women over the age of 55 particularly are the most at-risk group of homelessness, so that is a really big concern for the government. Likewise, if you are long-term unemployed at that age, you find it much, much harder to get back into work. So the prospects of actually getting work at that age are a lot harder until we change employers' minds on the older age group, that they are going to continue to be behind the 8 ball. But I do agree with you that young people, particularly young people like Sam, are paying commercial rates of rent. They're paying the same amount for food. They're paying the same amount for electricity. So there is yet another argument that perhaps they also would require a little bit more assistance.
Georgie, there's a raft of measures being introduced for parents. The single parent payment threshold changes. There's cheaper childcare. Has the government landed in a fair place?
Look, I think the fact that we have seen the single parenting payment restored to families, single parent families until their youngest is 14 is so welcome. It is such an important correction that will make a really significant difference. We know that at 8 years old, the care that a child still requires has to be recognised, and this payment, taking it to 14, is, the recommendation was to go to 16, but I do think there is a credible argument that 14 is a substantial and meaningful change that is long overdue.
There's also $72 million to support education and training of early childhood workers, but no pay rise. Does the government need to do something urgently to make sure that that workforce doesn't move over to aged care, because they will have a pay rise?
Yeah, so look, I mean, it is very significant that in this budget we see $11 billion, so the government is fully funding the increase to aged care workers' salaries, which was handed down through the Fair Work Commission. And that is a really strong signal to the early childhood education and care workforce that when they start the process using the new IR multi-employer bargaining laws, that they have got a good reason to hope that the government will turn up to those negotiations ready and willing to fund a pay rise. We know that the early childhood education and care workforce is at a really difficult point. Educators are leaving because they can't afford to stay, and the really significant increase in wages for aged care workers could very well have an impact, a further exacerbating impact on giving aged care early educators another option of where they can go, because at the moment early childhood educators are attempting to live on rates of pay of $24 an hour. They cannot afford to stay, and so they're leaving. But if we don't have early childhood educators, we don't have the places for children, so they have the access to the early learning they need, but then we won't have places for families to send their children so they can go to work, so we can enjoy the increased participation. And so we do need to see something for the early education workforce soon.
Georgie, Casey, Shalila, thank all three of you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Let's go to David Spears now with the Shadow Treasurer, Angus Taylor.
Angus Taylor, welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me, David.
The Liberal Party has long taunted Labor for being unable to deliver a surplus. This was the benchmark you set for responsible economic management. It must be hard tonight to watch Labor pass a test that the coalition couldn't.
Well, we did deliver budget balance in 2019, as you know.
Not a surplus.
And of course, the result of that was when we came to the end of the pandemic, the budget was in surplus from late 2021 through to the election. Now, the fact of the matter is a drover's dog could have delivered this surplus because there's been a more than $80 billion windfall for this financial year. $80 billion windfall. In revenues, and that's a big number, David.
But it does take more than
So the real test, though, is this, and this is the crucial point. Delivering a budget in 1 year when you've inherited an $80 billion windfall is great, good. We want to see that, but the real test is whether Labor was able to deliver sustainable budgets and a sustainable budget balance over the medium term. And this budget doesn't do that. And this is very, very important because the failure to do that is leaving serious inflationary pressures in the economy.
Let me just pick up your point about a drover's dog could have delivered this. It also does take some discipline, though, doesn't it? I mean, look at the coalition's final budget last year before you lost office. I mean, you splashed far more than Labor has on low and middle income tax bonuses, handouts to pensioners, you cut fuel excise for everyone, even those who didn't necessarily need it. And all this, as inflation was starting to spike, where was the restraint that you're now preaching?
There was a budget balance from the end of the pandemic in November 2021 through to May 2022 when the election was held.
So we now look in small 3-4 month windows.
Well, the truth was that's when the economy opened up. If you wanted us to... No country in the world was ever going to deliver a balanced budget during the pandemic, for good reasons. And remember, Labor wanted to spend $81 billion extra during the pandemic.
The point is, at the end of that, you're then splashing cash, and it does take discipline.
Well, not this kind of splashing cash. I mean, there's $185 billion of extra spending in this budget. I'm sure we're going to talk about all the measures. You can't get through $185 billion of measures in a few hours. That's what's extra in this budget.
Right, let's talk about it.
But this is a crucial point. There's $2 of extra spending initiatives for every dollar of extra revenue initiatives. This is inflationary. And that's the real risk in this budget, that hard-working Australians trying to get ahead are going to be held back by inflationary pressures, ongoing high interest rates.
So you're disagreeing with that?
Well, I've just heard Chris Richardson say it is inflationary, and Chris is an independent economist who I very much trust on these things.
The Treasury's wrong.
Well, Chris Richardson has been very clear on this. And if you're adding $2 of spending, I think they were talking about the energy initiatives net of rebates, so it was a very technical point. But $2 of extra spending initiatives for every dollar of extra revenue initiatives, that's inflationary.
Let's go through some of the new measures. A $40 a fortnight increase in JobSeeker to help those struggling to put food on the table. Will you back that?
Well, we very much want to. We want the very best for someone looking for a job. But the best thing for someone looking for a job is to get into a job. And as you and I have discussed, 430,000 job vacancies out there at the moment. That's almost one for every unemployed person. There's a lot of jobs to go around, and the key now is to get people into work, because the increase in income they will get from getting into work will be so much more than $40.
Okay,
I mean, it'd be hundreds of dollars. Well, I'm saying we will work through these things methodically. Look, we've got $185 billion of extra spending in this budget. There's a lot to work through. We'll work through it systematically, and I'm not going to give you answers after a few hours on all of these things. But
you can't say whether you. What about single parents?
Well, I think a
lot of women in particular need that extra help.
Yeah, and
will you support that?
I understand that. And again, this is something I'm not going to make a decision ahead of going through the processes with my colleagues. You know how it works.
So you're saying all this is inflationary, but you're not sure whether.
I'll give you some things that don't, where money doesn't need to be spent the way it is. $45 billion of spending that we've opposed in recent months, with $18 billion of interest costs attached to it.
These are the off-budget
funds. There's $18 billion of on-budget interest costs associated with that, David. So it's not off-budget.
Okay. What about the measures tonight? Is there anything you oppose?
Yeah, there are. So we've seen in this budget an extra 10,000 public servants in Canberra, and putting aside those working on national security or frontline services, we think that's excessive. We don't think that's necessary. Bigger government is not the answer when you've got inflationary pressures and cost of living.
Is that even $1 billion?
Well, it's significant numbers, and we'll have more to say about that. We're giving a budget. The leader will give a budget reply speech on Thursday.
What about the energy bill relief?
Well, we've been supportive of that all the way along, as you know. We've always supported that. And we've supported it for a simple reason, that Labor's failed to deliver on its $275 electricity price reduction. It is clear in the budget now that is a broken promise. They will not deliver it on this term of Parliament. Those numbers are now laid out very clearly.
Okay, so just finally on this, you're backing that energy bill relief, but on all the support payment increases, it's a bit unsure.
I was explaining to you why this one is different before you interrupted me, and it's different because Labor made a promise. People worked on that expectation. Labor's not going to deliver on that promise. So it is understandable that this is an area where there is a role for government to play. But I'd have to say, in general, what we want to see from the government is taking pressure off inflation. This is not a budget that does it. A typical family with 3 kids will be $25,000 worse off a year under this budget than they were. And I tell you, I know, David, there'll be a lot of people out there listening to this or watching this right now who are feeling worse off than they were a year ago. And this is not a budget that's going to alleviate that situation.
Angus Taylor, we'll have to leave it there. But thanks for joining us.
Thanks, David. Thanks for having me.
I'm joined now by the ABC's referendum and Voice correspondent Dan Borscher. Dan, the Voice referendum is likely to be less than 6 months away. Has the government set aside money in the budget to establish the voice if it is indeed passed?
Yeah, your mate, Jeremy, good to be with you. $360 million is what the government's put aside now up until this point. $30 million of that is new money in tonight's budget. The majority of that came throughout the announcements we've seen earlier. And the real focus I want to bring you to is $10 million that's been put aside by the government for mental health for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in the process around this debate this year. And we know that it's already been fraught and is causing quite a bit of distress in some Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities. So that's one of the key elements that's new money tonight. We also have seen that the $20 million that the former government announced previously about local regional voices that would be really those that speak into a national voice if the referendum is successful. That money's been held over and also, I suspect, neutralising a political attack. Warren Mundine's campaign group, Recognise a Better Way, has been given the tax status so that people can make tax-free donations.
There's also a bit of broader spending on Indigenous affairs, including what seems to be a new collaborative funding approach in Alice Springs. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so look, at the start of this year, we saw the Prime Minister go to Alice Springs when there was a whole lot of antisocial trouble there and announced about $48.8 million for immediate remediations and to help to deal with the situation on the ground. Well, in tonight's budget, we've also seen $250 million detailed. And in that, there's a whole lot of new spending, $50 million for infrastructure, $40 million for school attendance, $23 million to expand youth and child assessment and treatment, justice reinvestment, broadband, mobile, crime prevention and early intervention. And this has all been developed, I understand, in collaboration with the regional controller in Alice Springs in Central Australia, and also there's another $94 million that's been put aside to work further with the community to deal with some of those challenges as they arise. Now, this, of course, comes, Jeremy, as we've seen the Treasurer announced $1.9 billion for First Nations health, housing, education, employment. A whole lot of new spending announced tonight, including $238 million to improve cancer outcomes for First Nations people and $141 million to tackle Indigenous smoking and reduce vaping. Really a nod to those really difficult health challenges that face so many Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. And it was a small announcement, but I wanted to bring it to your attention, $1.7 million to create the interim First Nations Aged Care Commissioner that came out of a recommendation of the Aged Care Royal Commission. That's going to be sitting inside health and the process to create a formalised long-term role would really kick off, or if this is indeed passed by the Parliament.
Dan Borscher, thank you.
Thanks, Jeremy.
Now, there's been a lot of talk about the sustainability of the National Disability Insurance Scheme in the lead up to this budget. Our National Disability Affairs reporter, Naz Campanella, joins us to take us through the key points. Naz, the budget papers show the government expects to moderate growth in the NDIS quite significantly. Did they give any detail about how they plan to achieve that?
Look, it's fair enough to say, Jeremy, that the details were fairly light on in this budget around how this target is going to be achieved. For a bit of context, the government has known that the costs of the scheme have been rising annually at a growth of 14%, and it's now introducing a target of no more than 8% by 2026. Funding that has been allocated in the budget tonight is a figure of $732.9 million. And that's going towards making the scheme more sustainable. So we're talking here about it going to the National Disability Insurance Agency. Now, that is the agency that actually runs the NDIS, and the money will go towards things like improving the systems and bureaucracy, things like, for example, the average person has a 12-month plan. Those will move towards now longer-term planning, more flexible plans, increasing the capability of the NDIS and the agency that runs that. There's also a chunk of money, that being $48.3 million, that's going towards tackling fraud, something that everyone in the sector has been widely talking about for a long time now, and that's definitely going to be something that is widely welcomed. There's also some money that's being allocated to pilot studies into early intervention services for particularly infants who show signs of autism.
Now, Naz, what's the response likely to be from the sector and from the disability community?
Yeah, look, we've already heard some responses from the disability community and widely the sector. People with Disability Australia has really said that some of the questions, that people have had going into this budget are really the same questions that they've got on the other side now that we've seen what's in the papers. It's a bit more detail that is required on how this target will be met, and in particular, a reassurance that the community and disabled people want around a reassurance that their supports, their plans, that people getting, onto the scheme in the future will not bear the brunt of these costs. And also we've heard from the peak body for non-government service providers, National Disability Services, and they have widely sort of welcomed the growth target, saying that it is part of creating a sustainable scheme, but everyone has said that while there is a commitment in the budget to work with disabled people on co-design, that absolutely needs to be maintained and be followed in order to restore trust and really go forward and create a scheme that everybody wants to see in the future.
Naz, thank you. Let's head to Patricia Karvelas now. She's with the Greens leader, Adam Bandt.
Adam Bandt, welcome.
Thanks, Patricia.
JobSeeker has been increased across the board. Rent assistance is up 15% and bulk billing is tripled. Is this a budget well targeted to those most in need?
Look, Labor's budget leaves millions behind, leaving people in poverty while billionaires get tax cuts. And with $250 billion being spent on tax cuts for the very wealthy, it is a betrayal of renters, of job seekers, of people who are doing it tough. You mentioned JobSeeker.
JobSeeker has increased across the board, rent assistance up. You're saying that's a betrayal? I mean, that's record investment we haven't seen for a long time.
Job seekers will get $2.84 extra a day, which won't even buy you a loaf of bread and will leave them in poverty, while billionaires like Clive Palmer get a $9,000 a year tax cut. There's absolutely nothing for 5.5 million renters who don't get Commonwealth rent assistance. And for the ones who do, they're getting, if they get the maximum, about $1 a day. Rents in capital cities are growing 10 times faster than that. In the middle of a rental crisis, if the government had made the billionaires and big corporations pay their fair share of tax, we could have funded a rent freeze and lifted people out of poverty.
Let's go to the job seeker rate and the level they arrived at. The Treasurer, Jim Chalmers, spoke to my colleague David Spears a little earlier. He said they couldn't afford any more, largely. That was the reason. Do you accept that rationale? I mean, if you look at the budget, is it fair enough that they've had to come up with a compromise? He says, some people didn't want any increase.
No, because the government has put $250 billion in tax cuts for the wealthy and reaching a surplus ahead of lifting people out of poverty. I mean, you can't pay your rent with a surplus, and every dollar that goes on the surplus is a dollar not spent in lifting people out of poverty. They could have done it,
Do you think there's
but they
no
chose
case
not
for
to.
paying down debt right now?
Well, if the government really is serious about debt, why are they spending $250 billion on tax cuts for the wealthy? But look at what they're doing on the gas corporations. The gas corporations are getting away with paying next to no tax on this budget.
Well, they've introduced a tax that actually brings in, $2.5 billion?
And it's so weak that the government is raising more money by the lifting of student debt and making students pay more on their debt than they are from these big gas corporations.
Let's go to the fundamental questions you raise around housing. The Treasurer says ultimately the issue is about supply, and you're holding up a bill in the Senate which is actually all about providing supply. Given the government has put a 15% increase on rent assistance, does that get you closer to providing your support to the housing bill?
Well, the government is still not guaranteeing that money will actually be spent on affordable housing. They're putting $10 billion in a gamble on the stock market. They're saying if it makes a return, they might spend it. Last year it lost money, and so under the government's plan, you would have seen no spend on public housing.
Well, no, the government contests that. The minister says that's not the case, and that you would have seen a spend.
This is what we've been pushing for, guaranteed funding
right now,
on
by
public
you
housing.
Not supporting it, there's not a single house being built, is there?
Well, the government doesn't seem to understand the scale of the crisis. Under the government's plan, no guaranteed money for housing, and even if they do, there'll be nothing built till after the federal election.
So this doesn't get you any closer to supporting it?
We're willing to talk, but we need to see some serious money going on building new housing, and we want to see a rent freeze. There's nothing in this budget for renters who are doing it tough, but tax breaks for millionaires and politicians.
Adam Bandt, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
As we've already heard, a big focus of this budget was taking some cost of living pressure off struggling families. But what's What's in it for business? David Chow pored over the budget documents to find out.
For those of you running a business in this tough cost of living environment, what's happening with your customers is something worth worrying about. After all, consumer spending is one of the major drivers of Australia's economy, but that's going to slow down significantly this year. The surge in interest rates and high levels of inflation are expected to lead to a big fall in consumption growth, which isn't good for business. Despite that, Treasury reckons the outlook for business investment should be relatively positive due to a large pipeline of construction projects. But that's mainly from the non-mining industries, since the mining sector already had their big spending spree years ago. With that in mind, what this budget is offering for businesses is rather slim. Take the instant asset write-off, for instance. This incentive was a lot more generous back when COVID first struck. But now you're only allowed to make an instant tax deduction on assets that cost less than $20,000 each, so not enough to cover a ute. And it only applies to businesses with less than $10 million in yearly turnover. But there are better incentives for businesses that are behind on their taxes. So if your business tax bill was due between December 2019 and February 2022, and you still haven't paid it, the ATO won't fine you if you lodge your taxes by the end of this year. But that only applies to small businesses with turnover of less than $10 million. Treasury reckons this will increase tax receipts by $718 million over 5 years. There's also a green energy theme to this year's business offerings. So if you run a business and you're trying to save on your power bill by buying things like energy-efficient fridges, electric heating systems and battery storage, you'll be able to deduct an extra 20% of the cost of those items, though that's only for businesses with turnover of less than $50 million a year. Meanwhile, there are some incentives for startups. The government says it will spend $390 million over 4 years to help startups commercialise their ideas and grow their business, as long as it relates to net zero, renewables and low emissions technology. All up, considering the main focus of this budget is to provide targeted cost of living relief without boosting inflation, these measures for businesses are quite modest. But the government couldn't exactly leave them empty-handed.
And that brings to an end the first hour of this special coverage of Budget 2023.
Jim Chalmers has delivered his second budget, the centrepiece being a $14 billion cost of living package designed to take pressure off Australians suffering the most. There is increased rent assistance, an across-the-board increase to JobSeeker and a tripling of the bulk billing incentive for doctors.
Stay with the ABC for continuing coverage of the budget. Up next is a special edition of Insiders with David Spears, followed by The Business.
Good night.
Well, cost of living relief that apparently won't push up inflation. A brief surplus before a return to deficits. And on the economy, some better news before it gets worse. What to make of this budget? Should we be celebrating or worried? Welcome to a special budget night edition of Insiders, live from Parliament House. So we've heard from the Treasurer, we've heard from the Shadow Treasurer, we've heard from the Greens. Let's dive into some analysis tonight. We're joined first up by Andrew Probyn, Samantha Maiden and Tom Crowley. Welcome to you all after a long budget day, pouring through the documents. I want to start with the big news and a surplus. It's been a while. 15 years, longer than that since the last Labor surplus, which was Paul Keating's. Jim Chalmers has done it tonight. It's only brief. We go back into deficit after that. But Andrew, there's a lot of conjecture tonight over whether a drover's dog could have done this or whether it did involve a lot of difficult decisions. What's the truth?
I'm with the drover's dog.
Really?
I think there were some tricky and politically sensitive matters involving the oil and gas company, but the fact is...
The PRRT.
PRRT increase. The fact is, though, that Australia is doing really, really well from the war in Ukraine.
But it's the jobs market is even bigger.
The jobs market,
isn't it? The better employment market.
The jobs market is helping big time too, with unemployment remaining low and wages starting to pick up. The Treasury says that only about 1/5 of the commodity prices are responsible for the pickup when it comes to the budget surplus. But that's assuming, David, that commodity prices tumble again, and this is the benefit of having a very cautious outlook when it comes to prices for iron ore, gas and coal.
But Jim Chalmers would say, Sam, that he, in banking that revenue windfall, has done a lot more work than the previous government ever did. 82% of the windfall has been banked. He's had to say no, not to everyone, but more so, he reckons, than previous Treasury.
Well, he said yes to a lot of people as well. But I think that the thing that is interesting about the budget is if you look at the fact that he's banked a modest $4 billion surplus. That is the first time in 15 years. So, you know, we don't know whether Jim Chalmers will ever get another one, but he's got one tonight. But that is off the back of whacking people with a lot more of extra tax. Now, he makes the point that that's not, you know, it's not tax increases. It's reflecting the fact that people are working more and they're earning more, and that means that he's getting more tax. And in the budget alone, there was a $40 billion uptick. They are taking $40 billion more tax out of us now than they thought they were going to in October. And, you know, you think about that, that is a huge amount of cash. That is in 1 year, right? If you look at the 4 or 5 years, it's something like $130 or $140 billion. I can't remember the exact figure. And that tells you that, you know, they're only giving a fraction of that back in cost of living relief. And that's not even before we get to the stage 3 tax cuts.
Oh, we'll come to that
later.
The question that you asked the Treasurer in his press conference this afternoon. But, Tom, clearly the political debate tonight already and in the coming days is going to be whether this cost of living package is going to be inflationary, whether it's going to make the job of the Reserve Bank more difficult. The Treasury advice, and certainly Jim Chalmers' position on this, is that no, it's not. You're ex-Treasury. What do you think?
It's always dangerous being introduced as ex-Treasury on budget day. I should make that disclaimer.
I couldn't resist.
Look, I think that, to be honest, I find that discussion a little bit of a sideshow, because I think you can make the point that if you're taking $1 off someone's power bill, you've knocked $1 off CPI. Now, on the other hand, you've added perhaps 20, 30, 40, 50 cents in demand elsewhere in the economy, and so there's a debate to be had there about whether
it sounds like a one hand and the other hand.
Well, it is.
You can't get the Treasury out of this.
What are you?
But it is. I mean, I think it's fairly marginal in the grand scheme of things, and I think that comes back to. I mean, if I can go back to the question of the kind of the budget balance and the ambition, like, I think it all depends on where you set the goalposts, how you want to mark this budget, because as you say, you know, the Treasurer would like us to focus on the fact that the previous government would have sort of struggled to outperform the drover's dog as far as banking, you know, these sorts of revenue variations. But for a government that has kind of set up the fact that it wants to do more cost of living support, but it can't because of this fiscal challenge, I sort of agree with Andrew. I think there wasn't enough ambition.
And the savings are a bit of a blancmange, right? So when journalists get into the budget lockup, we always go to that glossy document and you flip it to the back where it tells you the major expenditure and the major savings. Now, usually they tell you a figure, right, of how much they'd saved, but there was this weird terminology that they kept using. What did they kept saying? It was budget improvements. They didn't say savings, but there was something about redirection. They read the...
Well, there's an even better table for those playing along at home. It's in the actual budget paper number 1, and it's on page 94. Chris Richardson always calls it the table of truth.
Right.
And that puts together, well, it clearly states government policy decisions and how that's impacted on the bottom line. And it's a cost to the bottom line of just over $20 billion over 4 years.
And this is the one where the tax decisions are $20 billion extra raised, the new spending decisions, $40 billion extra spent. So that table tells us that $2 new are spent for every extra dollar that's raised.
But you've got to say, it's missing something though, isn't it, David? It's missing the aged care spending.
That 20 does not include, you're right, the extra $11 billion on aged care pay. But look, to the Treasurer's point, let's play a little of it here. This is Jim Chalmers arguing that this cost of living package is not going to be inflationary.
This budget is carefully calibrated to alleviate inflationary pressures, not add to them. Our policies to ease the pressure on households will take 0.75 of a percentage point off inflation in 23-24.
So, I mean, look, you've got to say, though, that in the way that he structured the cost of living package, and he had to do something, it was politically untenable not to offer something for job seeker and rent assistance and these sort of measures. it has been structured in a careful way when it comes to inflation, hasn't it?
Oh, look, it's clever in the sense that he has targeted the inputs into CPI. So
energy,
exactly,
and health costs as well.
So if CPI is a measure of various aspects of our economy, and you attack one with a subsidy, then it does have that flow-on effect. Now, Treasury is saying it's about 0.75. With when you look at the price caps on coal and gas, plus the rebate on household bills. That's quite clever.
So then we come back to this question of could the Treasurer and the government have been bolder? Could they have gone tougher to deal with this structural deficit that very quickly returns in the coming years? And we heard Danielle Wood, we heard Chris Richardson, we've heard plenty argue, what about the stage 3 tax cuts? What about capital gains tax? What about trusts? You know, there's a list of things that could be done, politically difficult to do, but Sam, where is the reference to the stage 3 tax cuts in this budget? Let me just play your question to the Treasurer because it was a cracker.
The budget is completely silent on the stage 3 tax cuts. The public servants told us in the lockup that they weren't allowed to tell us what the new revised forecasts are. Why is it the Voldemort of the budget? Why are there no references to the tables of the generous tax cuts that you'll be offering, not too long from now? And what is the revised forecast of how much these will cost over the next 4 years and in 2024 when they begin?
Well, the way we've approached this in the budget's been entirely consistent with standard budget practice, and because they were legislated some time ago and because the government's position hasn't changed on them, they wouldn't ordinarily be itemised like a new spending initiative would be.
He did give a number, though, fortunately, which was $69
billion. And so I think it's really interesting to think of that figure in terms of what this being a cost of living budget, right? So, I'm not being pejorative, I'm just saying let's look at the numbers, right? So they're giving $14 billion over 4 years to the vulnerable, and they're going to give $69 billion over the next 4 years to the wealthy. Well, not give.
The wealthy
but,
get more of a benefit.
But they, and so, those tax cuts, and you'll hear a lot more of that about them in years to come. They are nowhere in the budget. You can't find them.
Which is interesting. What does that mean? They're not putting big highlighter around it.
Well, no. What it means is that it's not a new measure. So the Treasurer is correct to say that doesn't have to be there. But it didn't stop Scott Morrison and Josh Frydenberg sticking them in every year and putting a little table. They're embarrassed. I don't want to say they're embarrassed by them, but they're trying to hide them, right? Because it is at odds with their argument about it being a cost of living budget. If you are it's not a $69 billion handout, but you are allowing people to keep more of what they earn if they're wealthy. And those tax cuts, if you're earning $40,000 a year, you get nothing. If you're earning $50,000 a year, you get $125 a year under those tax cuts. And if you earn $200,000 a year, you get a $9,000 a year tax cut. Now, that is double what they are offering to single mums.
We can speculate about where that debate might go in the year or years ahead. Andrew, the NDIS, I wanted to ask you about this because I know you've been having some conversations about it. We did see a couple of weeks before the budget, the Prime Minister announced this new target to limit the growth of the NDIS to 8% a year from 2026. And we see an updated figure in the budget tonight of what that will save over the decade. It was
$59 billion.
But how are they going to do that?
Well, it's quite clear they're going to have to, and they're planning to revisit how participants deal with the system. It looks like, first of all, well, in fact, there's a few prongs to it. First of all, they're going to try and ensure that participants have packages that are paid for according to the outcome as opposed to the hours given to them. Because at the moment, as I understand it, there's an incentive for providers to ensure that, little Johnny comes in every Tuesday or every second Tuesday. There's an incentive, financial incentives for reports to be written. They want to introduce blended payments, which I understand is involving a whole lot of allied providers getting together and working within a certain sum. So there are ways and means they're planning to do it, but that's a hell of a lot of money to try
and none
of
that. It is, and none of that's easy. Those changes you're talking about.
None is easy.
Look, just quickly in terms of the opposition, the Greens. what needs to get through Parliament. There go the bells, if you can hear them, that ring here in Parliament House. We genuinely are live in Parliament House tonight. What's going to struggle to get through the Parliament based on what we've heard from both Angus Taylor and Adam Bandt tonight? Tom, what do you think?
I was busy recording a podcast while those interviews were done, so I didn't hear too much from them. I mean, I think it'll be, I imagine the Greens' concerns largely revolve around kind of not going far enough, but it's difficult to imagine them voting against anything like an increase in JobSeeker that's not as big as they would hope that it would be. So I can't think of too many things in this budget being a fairly uncontroversial budget that would have difficulty going through the Parliament.
I imagine the Greens will try and ramp up the rent assistance because that's only a 15% increase. I mean, I'm not saying that they'll be able to do that, but they'll certainly be saying it's not generous enough.
We will see. Well, any final call from you?
Look, I think PRRT will get through, grumbling sense possibly from both sides. It's quite clear that the opposition also supports the energy supplement, so that should be fine.
Angus Taylor did make that very clear tonight already.
What about the poor Northern Territorians and the WA people that don't get as much, and the ACT people, but we probably won't cry over them, but that's me, of course. But they're giving more. You get $500 if you're in Victoria, South Australia, most states, New South Wales, but you only get $350 if you're in WA.
They're all down to the state and territory governments and what they agreed to pay. Is that right?
Well, I think it's based on the fact that they say they have lower electricity prices, but I'm sure that they'd like the same amount as everyone.
All right, Tom, Sam, Andrew, thank you very much for joining us after a very busy budget day. We've got another panel with some fresh perspectives coming up. We're going to go now, though, to Mike Bowers in a special budget edition of Talking Pictures.
I'm Mike Bowers and I'm photographer at large for The Guardian Australia. We've come to the press gallery to do a very special edition of Talking Pictures in the budget lockup. These days the budget lockup is the press gallery. Photographers and editors, journalists, cameramen and even cartoonists are locked up from about midday so they can prepare their materials so that as soon as the Treasurer's speech hits the dispatch box in the House of Representatives, they're ready to go with all the information. Let's go and see David Rowe, one of Australia's best cartoonists, to see how he's getting on. Hey David, how's your budget day going?
Hey Mike, how you going?
Where do you get your inspiration from? I take it you don't sit there and read the voluminous tomes of budget papers.
No, well, I'm luckily enough, I've got Phil and Mike's here.
Phil
Corey. Phil Corey's here.
If Phil Corey's your inspiration, you're in trouble.
No, I don't want to.
And with the main cartoon, it's the day that you guys generally knock photography off the front page. It's Cartoonist Day, basically.
It's probably, Stutch likes to get his image on the front page, and so we have a lot of conversations about getting that right.
And what's your thinking thus far?
Well, I've already sort of started a couple, so we come up with a couple of options. Yeah, plan A, plan B, and then we'll probably end up going plan C at the end. But I've already got a couple there.
Yep.
I've sort of got a more elaborate one that I'm sort of reasonably happy with.
Yes.
And then a couple of rough with the...
The back in black mark's rather nice.
Yeah, I know, with the dual handles mirroring Jim's ears.
Do many of the treasurers contact you afterwards and ask them for the originals?
No. No, but maybe I'm a little too savage for them or something, I'm not sure.
I've come to the press conference within the lockup to talk to AAP photographer Lucas Koch about what it is he's trying to do. Lucas, we saw you running around the press gallery before when the Treasurer and the Finance Minister were both there. What were you trying to do then?
I was looking for interaction between Chalmers and the media, and then just a few pictures of Chalmers and Katie Gallagher, especially the arrival pictures.
Yep. So they're trying to sell the budget to the journalists up there.
Yeah, explain, I guess, if there are questions.
So down here in the press conference room, it's just really two people standing behind a podium. So the Treasurer and Finance Minister stand up for about 3/4 of an hour usually. That's pretty mundane stuff, isn't it? What are you trying to pull out of this?
Yeah, it's pretty boring, to be honest. There's not much to play with, so I look for expressions. We photographed the Treasurer and the Finance Minister quite a lot, so we know their mannerisms. We know when they point, when they might give us a different expression, and that's what I'm looking for.
Well, it's now 6:30 and the lock-up's nearly over. How did you go, David?
I'm going reasonably well for a budget. Yeah, it's usually quite stressful because I've got so much work on. But I sort of have them all going at the same time.
Right. And which do you think will be the front page?
I'm hoping this one, the magician. Yeah, it's his top hat as the back in black mud sort of thing, and I've obviously. Great minds.
So that'll be the front, so long as the powers that be don't change their minds?
Yeah, that's right. And so I used all the rabbits just as almost blank canvases so we can sort of put on, the cost of living and stuff like that,
It's been great spending a bit of time with you in the lock-up, and I'll let you get on with it.
Oh, good on you. And back to you, David.
Thank you, David Rowe. The brilliant David Rowe. Wonderful to see that. And Mike, thank you so much, Lucas Koch, as well. I want to bring in our next panel this evening to pour through what's in the budget. I'm joined by Claudia Long, John Keogh and Patricia Karvelas. Very good evening to all of you. PK, let me just pick up on what we were discussing before that. In terms of what elements of this budget are going to get through the Parliament, what's going to struggle to get through. You've just been talking to Adam Bandt as well. What's your sense of how successful the government is likely to be with these sort of measures tonight?
Well, look, ultimately, I think all of these measures, when it comes to targeted assistance, rent assistance up 15%, job seeker up, I think they will get through. I can't imagine a Senate stymieing the pathway for cost of living relief for some of the most vulnerable people. But they'll only get through after the Greens put up, I think, a significant fight, because I did speak to the Greens leader, Adam Bandt, and his language was incredibly strident, and he was really, really up for a fight, it seems, on these measures, saying that people have been condemned essentially to poverty and that this was not enough. And not a lot of credit given to the government for these measures. Now, what's the other pathway if the government, doesn't want to play with a hardball Greens, although I think ultimately they won't stand in its way? It's the coalition. Now, you interviewed Angus Taylor. They're not really telling us what they'll do. But I do think it'll be very difficult, even if they argue, and I know John will talk about that, about the inflationary impact. It'll be pretty hard for the coalition to vote against such a modest increase to the job seeker payment.
His argument seemed to be it should be easy enough to get a job. That's the best way to help them. Just the tone of that seemed to strike me that he wasn't really in a mood to
but when you asked about single parents who are overwhelmingly mothers, something that, the fact that they were on this lower unemployment benefit is really a legacy issue of the Howard government completed by the Gillard government. I do think they're more sympathetic to that.
It's tricky for them, is the bottom line. It's difficult.
It is tricky, but it does seem quite mean-spirited to stand in the way of what is such a small amount. But on the fundamentals of the way they're going to play this, I do feel like they need now for economists and others to mount the case for them that this is inflation.
Well, John, are economists going to say, and do you think this is inflationary? It's quite a clear divide now. Angus Taylor reckons it is. Jim Chalmers and Treasury are saying it ain't.
I don't think it's deflationary. I mean, the government's been putting around the argument that this is going to help ease inflation pressures, take pressure off the Reserve Bank. And while they're making a good start by banking most of that revenue windfall, about 80% of the revenue upgrades, they are still adding a net increase to spending in the economy at a time when inflation's very high, 7%. And I mean, you would hope at this point in time they would have more spending or saving offsets to offset some of these measures that they obviously want to deliver for the vulnerable people out there, the Labor Party base. So I think it was a good start, but actually I don't see it taking pressure off interest rates or off inflation. And arguably, they're putting a bit more money into the economy. I certainly don't think it's going to make the RBA's job any easier.
Claudia, we're talking kind of at the macro level here, but let's get back to what this is going to mean for real people. The job seeker increase, the rent allowance increase. We should also point out Austudy and youth allowance go up as well. What difference will this make to the lives of young people in particular?
Well, it really depends, doesn't it? Because I was looking into youth allowance today, which is going up by $40 a fortnight. Now, that levels out to $2.85 a day. That's less than it actually cost me to get the bus here this morning. $2.85 extra a day. You know, at the moment, I think it's fair to say that doesn't go very far for a lot of people, particularly young people. If you're just new to the workforce, you haven't had a chance to save up very much. And youth allowance now $42.85 a day. And yes, like absolutely increases to rent assistance. If you're in a share house, that's a $15 increase per fortnight. That's coming off the back of some of the biggest rent increases we've ever seen.
More than $15.
That's right, exactly, more than $15. And so I think Labor's got a challenge on its hands on how they are going to sell this to younger voters, particularly when, you know, we've seen job seeker increase for over 55s, and that is absolutely, you know, an important thing to do. We know that there is a growing cohort in that age bracket of women who are becoming homeless, who are really struggling. But I think Labor's got a challenge on how do they say, okay, young voters, actually, you do matter to us, particularly in seats where Labor used to be safe. But we know now that seats with higher proportions of young voters are flipping green. And particularly on housing, like PK was just saying, the Greens are playing hardball on this.
Yeah, they're going very hard.
They are going hard, yeah.
Do we know much, John or PK, about the internal debate around job seeker and these other support payments in that ERC, the Expenditure Review Committee? Was Jim Chalmers trying to hold the line against too much spending here? How much influence did that backbench pressure we saw a couple of weeks ago have, do you think, on where things have ultimately landed? What do you reckon?
I think the revenue upgrades came in pretty late from Treasury, which was a sort of strategy to try and keep some of the spending at bay, but inevitably the higher revenue numbers come in at some point, and there is going to be more pressure on Chalmers to do it. Having said that, I mean, I think it is in his ethos and his belief system that he would have wanted to do something. I think that's his belief system. So, yes, I think he was probably trying to show a bit of fiscal discipline, but also I think he probably fundamentally believed in giving an increase to some vulnerable people.
Yeah, I think he's a values politician, and these are pretty fundamental values for him. Look, he always wanted to deliver a job seeker increase. I think the issue with the modest across-the-board job seeker increase, and look what happened when there was really the strongest campaign I've seen. It won't become a quiet campaign.
From the backbench, though, do you think they'll be satisfied, or will that pressure?
Not all of them. I can't predict because I haven't seen any sort of breakouts, but I think there will be an ongoing campaign for it to be increased again. In fact, in the budget lockup, I asked the Treasurer, you know, is this job done on job seeker, really? And clearly there will be pressure on the government, and because of, you know, high commodity prices, the fact that, you know, we are really taxation, it's the taxation story, isn't it? We are seeing so much revenue come in. There will be pressure that Jim Chalmers has to push back on other issues as well from his own side of politics, who will see that and go, don't get too excited about surpluses. What else can we do with it?
Yeah, Claudia, there was also, well, the centrepiece, in fact, I think the Treasurer called it, was on health tonight. There's $5 billion all up. A lot of this is going to the tripling of the bulk billing incentive. So hopefully that will see more bulk billing made available. I should point out that's for children, pensioners and concession card holders. There's a change in the indexation rate for other GP rebates as well that should benefit them a bit too. What didn't they do, though, on health?
I think particularly for women's health, it's a bit of a mixed bag. So we have at the ABC, you know, our winners and losers that we put up online every year, and we were trying to categorise where do women fall into this. And given that spending is stretched over so many things when it comes to gender, health is one of them. And at best, it's neutral this year for women's health, I think.
Why is that?
Well, it's a bit of a mixed bag because we've got $26.4 million over 4 years that's going into research, looking specifically at gaps in research and data collection when it comes to women's health. We know that has a massive impact on diagnosis and then later health outcomes for women. But in terms of contraception and sexual and reproductive health, I looked through budget paper 2 today and there was pretty much nothing. And I've been speaking with doctors in this space tonight who are pretty disillusioned with what we're seeing, which is not a lot. The women's budget statement, which is its own little book, and we all got a copy today. It mentions the Women's Health Advisory Council. That's made up of a group of very senior and respected doctors in this space who are advising the Assistant Minister for Health, responsible for women's health, Jed Carney. But it doesn't actually include the budget, any spending for their recommendations. And not only that, there's no word on whether telehealth item numbers for sexual and reproductive health are going to be extended beyond June. So I'm still looking for that in the budget. This is, when it comes to contraception and abortion services, there's not a lot.
Yeah, there's a bit of unfinished business there. I know there's some disappointment on the education front tonight too, that there wasn't more in the budget on that front. But this is always going to happen with budgets. You can't please everyone.
No.
But just in the minute or so we've got left, do you think, how would you describe what the Treasurer has tried to do, and the Prime Minister, with this budget? Is it trying to please as many as it can without creating too much of an inflation problem?
I think he's actually been quite successful in a couple of areas. Labor has, I think, done a substantial job in really remaking its image as strong economic managers. I don't think we can downplay the delivery of the surplus and the banking of the extra revenue. I think it's actually a really significant story. And at the same time, no, I don't think it's trying to please everyone, actually. I think it is quite targeted, the support. Even when you mention the bulk billing incentive, it is really targeted at those who are struggling the most. It's not sort of for everyone in a very broad way. So I think they've tried to address the most acute need, but at the same time build their credentials as better economic managers, deal with some issues, but they want to be a two-term government at least, don't they? They've got more work to do.
Well, they do. John, your final 2 cents on what he's tried to do and whether he's landed it.
Yeah, well, we've got a massive tax revenue windfall in the short term. We can't be guaranteed to have that for the medium term. I think the risk for Jim Chalmers is he has delivered for a lot of the groups that Labor was under pressure from single parents to the unemployed, and some of the other welfare recipients as well. I suppose from a budgetary perspective, that is going to send a signal to a lot of other people heading into future budgets, heading towards elections, that if we campaign hard enough, we can get something out of this Treasurer. And so he's going to have a big balancing act going forward when the revenue might not quite be as strong.
We will have to leave it there, but thank you very much, Patricia, John, Claudia. Great to get your analysis on this budget night. Thank you for joining us as well. Do stay with us for The Business. That's coming up next. And of course, join me Sunday morning. We'll be back with Insiders. The Treasurer will be joining us at the end of this very busy budget week. Bye for now.
Welcome to the Business Budget Special. I'm Catherine Robinson. A commodities windfall and tax receipt bonanza has delivered the government a flash surplus, the first in 15 years. It's the Treasurer's second budget, with cost of living measures worth almost $15 billion and incentives to make Australia a renewable energy superpower at the centre. While there are some measures for small businesses, some economists say they've largely missed out, that productivity has not been addressed adequately, and the government has wasted an opportunity for real tax reform. The government has banked 82% of tax receipts, contributing to the $36 billion budget improvement this year. But structural pressures remain from the NDIS, debt interest payments, aged care, defence and healthcare, which will see deficits in future years peaking at 25-26. Gross debt will reach more than $1 trillion within 4 years. The economy will slow to 1.5% and unemployment will hit 4.5%. Over the same period, inflation will fall to the RBA target range of between 2 and 3%, by which time Australians can expect real wages to pick up. We'll speak to the Finance Minister shortly, but first, this report from Stephanie Chalmers on whether the budget is inflationary.
When the times get tough, this retailer sees it showing up in customer orders.
It's an interesting bellwether, right? What we see is what's on people's minds, whether that be stress management, whether that be financial planning.
A major priority for businesses like this one is for households to feel confident enough to spend.
Some surety about how the costs are going to go, whether that be inflation, interest rates, fuel prices, all of those things all coincide.
The challenge for households is weathering the cost of living crisis, which flows through to businesses which rely on them as customers. The challenge for the Treasurer is providing relief to businesses and households without further fuelling inflation. So has he delivered?
I'm a hard marker.
So this is a fail. This was Jim Chalmers' chance to really cut some fat out of the budget to fight the inflation fight. He's missed that opportunity.
Others think it will go some way to reducing headline inflation at least.
We definitely don't think it's disinflationary or deflationary, but we wouldn't say we characterise this as an inflationary budget.
The budget provides energy relief of up to $500 for around 1 million small businesses, which for some can't come soon enough.
It may seem like we're busy, but the overheads are killing us.
There's also around $300 million for small and medium enterprises to electrify their operations and upgrade equipment through a tax break of up to $20,000.
It's really dependent on whether there's going to be compatible machinery so that we can make that change, and whether it's going to be cost effective.
Other measures for business include an extension to the instant asset write-off, but only for items up to $20,000, an industry growth program to help SMEs and startups commercialise their ideas, support to improve cybersecurity, more money for artificial intelligence, and a revamped national skills agreement, creating more TAFE places and apprenticeships.
As an Australian employer, wanting to make sure that the pool of people that we get to recruit from is as talented and as educated as possible.
Business is also funding some of the tax measures through a minimum 15% tax rate for large multinationals and changes to the petroleum resource rent tax.
We have a wonderful resource-rich economy. We need to tax rents on those revenue sources, and we're not doing it. And, we've gone soft again with the PRT deal.
Whether big business is happy with the budget wash-up, some smaller operators are pleased with any assistance.
It's been quite tough for small businesses in general, so any relief from the government is welcomed.
Help, it's hoped, won't add heat to the economy.
Stephanie Chalmers with that report there, and I spoke to the Finance Minister, Katy Gallagher, a short time ago. Minister, welcome to The Business.
Thanks for having me on.
Now, the budget has these modest and meaningful measures on the revenue side, including changes to tax on super, multinationals tax, the PRRT changes and others. Are these low-hanging fruit? I mean, should the government have been more bold when it comes to reform?
Well, I think the budget has a very strong reform message. Obviously, we've been upfront about some of the challenges with the budget, so there are some revenue increases. We've been clear about that. As you say, super, multinational tax reform are a couple of those, and the PRRT. But, certainly from my point of view, the finance point of view, we're looking at the whole budget, so we're looking at savings in our spending, we're looking at spending restraint overall, and then putting the budget on a more sustainable and resilient footing. And I think you'll see that. The budget obviously isn't going to solve everything, one budget in one year, but I think it makes pretty good progress towards that sustainability that I think everybody's been looking for.
Well, the medium-term outlook has improved substantially. By 2032, there's an underlying cash deficit of 0.5% of GDP. That's 1.5% smaller than what was projected in October. Given that, is there now going to be less incentive for changes or reforms, particularly in those tougher areas such as personal income tax, GST, CGT, negative gearing?
Well, you're right that the medium story is more positive, and part of that is the restraint that we're showing in this period of time, in the near, the first years of the forward estimates, because it's really about that spending restraint, less debt, less interest on that debt, some of the steps we've put in place over moderating the growth in the NDIS that really make a difference over the medium term. But I would also say, and I'm very cautious about this, being the Finance Minister, I know that the pressures that are coming towards the budget are increasing, not decreasing. So even though it's an improving budget position over the medium term, we know that those big areas of spending, defence, health, aged care and the NDIS continue to put pressure on the budget, as does the servicing of the debt that we inherited. And, we've made good inroads into that in this budget, but there's more work to be done.
If we can look at the measures for a small business that were included today, there was a $20,000 instant asset write-off, there was a small business energy incentive and help around the digital technology sector. But is that really enough? Have small business almost been forgotten in this in light of all the other measures?
Not at all. I think those measures are important, but they're not the only measures in the budget. I mean, they're small business specific, but I think when you look at the investments that we're rolling out the door through the energy transition, through the National Reconstruction Fund, there are huge opportunities for small business. There's also measures around cyber security, around anti-scams, which these are big areas for small business where they're affected, and we want to make sure we're getting the response right there. And indeed, one that hasn't really been talked about very much is how we want to move forward with a digital ID. Again, from a cyber security point of view, I think that is a huge opportunity for small business there. So I think the budget is hundreds, if not thousands, of decisions that lands in that one final book. But there's a bigger story there, certainly for small business. Those measures you outlined are clear in the budget, but there's those other ones that I've just talked about, which small business can have a huge crack at as well.
Minister, what are the initiatives in the budget that will result in increased productivity, grow the pie, so Labor can keep up its social spending agenda?
Yeah, so there is a productivity challenge that, you know, has been raised by the Productivity Commission and others. This has been a focus of ours. Obviously, some of our proposals and investments in women and driving women's economic equality is part of that story. We're really serious about that. We've got an untapped resource there where women face barriers to work, barriers to the hours they work, the jobs they do, and we've got to start getting rid of those. So this is a really strong budget for women. Investing in people, obviously investing in the new technologies and new opportunities in the economy is part of the story as well. So I think there's a really solid growth story there, and we're serious about the energy transition, but also how we support women in particular, how we support workers in the aged care and the care economy. The opportunities that are there are real and substantial, and I think that paints a pretty positive future for the country. But, you know, the work isn't done in one budget. We've got more to do, more work to do, both in our investments and in how we manage the budget responsibly.
Finance Minister Katy Gallagher, thank you.
Thanks so much.
Well, joining me now in the studio to discuss is our business editor Ian Verinder, Barrenjoey Chief Economist Joe Masters and E61 Institute Research Manager Lachlan Vass. Good evening to you all. Thank you very much for your time. Ian, if I can begin with you, you've called this the turnaround of the century. How much of it can be put down to great economic management?
Well, not a lot, Kath. I mean, the great paradox here is that, you know, at a time when most Australians are struggling to put a roof over their heads, pay for power, buy food, the government is actually swimming in cash. And it's largely down to the fact that we've got record numbers of Australians in work at the moment. That means they're paying tax. And the opposite of that is we've got less people on social security, so there's less outflow there. So we've got a big surge in income tax receipts. And then with corporate tax, you've got resource companies with record resource prices, aided by one of the weakest Australian dollars ever during a resources boom. I mean, think back to when we had that resources boom with China a decade ago. The dollar was at $1.10. It's now less than 70 cents. So we've seen a surge in income, and that means that the Treasurer has sat back and watched a lot of this happen.
And it grow and turn into the coffers. Joe, this budget is banking this year 87%, 82%, I think, over the 2 years in tax receipt upgrades. It's reducing payments by $83 billion over 12 years. It's improving the underlying cash balance. What do you think about the fiscal positioning here? What has the government got right, and where could it have done better?
Well, the Treasurer really framed this budget around relief, repair and restraint. I would add reform to that. So if we look at those 4 Rs, we would give them a tick for relief, and I think most Australians would support the need to help out those households that Ian talked about. If we look at repair, as you said, a material amount of the economic windfall has gone to paying off debt, and that has a really lasting impact through that interest bill. I wouldn't give them such a good grade, though, around restraint. We have seen an increase in net government spending as a percent of GDP. Now, it's growing at a lower pace than it was pre-pandemic, but perhaps could have done more there. And a lot of that, of course, is around the NDIS. Material reduction in payment growth there, but no real plan on how to achieve that. And look, on the last one, reform, it was a pretty lacklustre budget if you think about big structural reform that we need to grow the pie.
And we'll unpack more of that later in the program. Lachlan, the government is saving 80% but still spending 20%. Jim Chalmers says the cost of living relief will be deflationary, reducing CPI by 0.75 percentage point. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, so that's what the government puts in its budget, and that's what it wants you to believe. And in a mechanical sense, yeah, it decreases the CPI. But if we take a step back and think about what the government's doing, as Joe said, the government's spending more. And so they've got their net impact is $12 billion in the next financial year. And so for a given level of goods and services, they're spending more. And so that can only lead to more inflation in a general sense. And so that's going to be a question for the RBA governor about how big, if that's a big inflationary impact or it's a small one, and what sort of response the RBA needs to do.
Well, you say there's a question, Joe?
Yeah, I was just going to jump in there. So I think that is the question. It's the magnitude of it. And also the biggest contributor to that is around the energy bill relief. And of course, the RBA knew that, and it is baked into their forecast. So when we run that through our modelling, we do get an inflationary lift, but it's not material enough to really alter the economic outlook or our views for the RBA.
If you think of the politics, though, did they have an option, really? Could they have, restrained themselves more in that regard?
Well, I think that's right. They're not making the problem any worse, but they're not helping. Yeah. And you're really leaving the inflation challenge to monetary policy, which is blunt and has very famous long and variable lags.
So has that then... Sorry, yes?
No, maybe not disinflationary, but maybe not inflationary, I think is the summary.
That's right. Well, so there's a difference between the two. So very briefly, Ian, does this make the RBA's job harder?
Well, look, that depends on what happens with the global economy later this year. I mean, there's, a lot of forecasts out there that the Reserve Bank will be cutting rates later this year, that the US Federal Reserve will be in a serious rate cutting mode late this year and early next year. So all of these assumptions and forecasts that we've heard tonight could be thrown out the window.
Well, the budget is positioning Australia to be a renewable energy superpower, committing over $40 billion to this ambition with a green hydrogen initiative. For business reaction, let's head to Perth, where Rachel Papazoni is speaking to corporate leaders. Hi there, Rach.
Hi, Kath. Thanks so much. And joining me here are Elizabeth Gaines, who is a director with Fortescue and a global ambassador, as well as Kate West, who's the co-chair of Arup Australasia, which is a global engineering firm and it first had its presence here in Australia when it helped with the Sydney Opera House. Elizabeth, I'll start with you. The government injects $2 billion into hydrogen as part of the budget announced this evening. This is an area that FMG through FFI has been investing in for some time. Do you put this down as a win for that investment that the company has put forward so far? And do you think it is enough from the government to help us achieve net zero by 2050?
Well, Rachel, I think it's a recognition of the foresight that Fortescue's had to actually recognise that renewable energy and green hydrogen is going to play an important role in the energy transition. And Australia has an opportunity to play an important part in that energy transition and contribute not only domestically to hydrogen production, but also to a growing export market. So the opportunity is enormous. In terms of whether this is enough, I think it's a great signal that the government is taking the energy transition seriously. If I contrast that to the Inflation Reduction Act in the US that was introduced late last year, that's a $369 billion support package. So $2 billion is a really good start. Yet to see the full details. I think it's going to be in the form of revenue support, so potentially production contracts for large-scale projects. But it's a really important signal that Australia will play an important part in this energy transition.
Kate, does it give businesses such as yours, I guess, the confidence and the green light to invest yourselves? And I wonder your view also from a global perspective of Australia, which has so far, until the change of government, been seen by some as a laggard when it comes to climate change action.
Absolutely. Look, it's been fantastic to see the commitment of federal government over the last year to tackling climate change and really leaning into this climate change challenge that we've got. And you can see through decarbonisation, the energy transition, a really strong agenda to support the work of industry in this space. And it's certainly an area that Arup's involved with strongly globally and increasingly in Australia, working with groups like FFI. But I think one of the really critical issues that we've been talking about in the last year is making sure that this transition is just and equitable, and that we are supporting, reskilling, redeploying people into these future-focused areas. So we're really pleased with the government's commitment to hydrogen, but also in the establishment of the National Net Zero Transformation Authority, which will help with that process of future-proofing the jobs and skills.
Elizabeth, you mentioned hydrogen as an export. There are some out there who doubt the viability of that. We've seen, as part of these budget measures, increases in taxes in terms of the PRRT. Do you see a future where hydrogen replaces LNG as a key export commodity for Australia?
Well, I certainly see a future where hydrogen and the export of renewable energy will be as important as iron ore, other commodities and LNG have been to the Australian economy. And look at the contribution that our sector has made, nearly $30 billion in corporate taxes across the mining industry in the FY21 years. So the contribution the mining industry is there to see. It's an important part of the Australian economy, and certainly renewable energy and green hydrogen. We know there is demand offshore for renewable energy. We've already got demand from Germany. We've seen the energy crisis emerging in Europe as a result of the invasion of Ukraine by Russia. So there is a crisis, energy crisis, and there is demand. And we already see that we have partners in Germany who are seeking 5 million tonnes of green hydrogen as quickly as they can.
Kate, $40 billion towards renewable investment plans. Are there any measures that you saw in the budget that focus on your area of expertise in infrastructure?
Look, we were really pleased with the commitment by Minister King to undertake the Infrastructure Investment Program review. And I think it really signals a strong intent by government to make sure that we're committing to nation-building projects and we're delivering the highest return on investment of infrastructure more broadly. So we really look forward to that coming through with a clear roadmap, with that clarity, delivering confidence to industry more broadly, consultants like Arup, but also contractors about the opportunities that lie ahead of us.
Elizabeth, we've heard measures to encourage more women into the workforce. That will help productivity with businesses like both of yours. What do you make of the measures to increase childcare, to help single parents for a longer period of time?
Well, I'm certainly a big advocate for increasing participation of women in the workforce and creating greater security. We know that there are, there's a lot of women who over 55, for example, who don't have that same financial security. They might have been out of the workforce for a period of time and they don't have the same superannuation balances. So I know that job seekers have been increased to support women, people over 55. I think that's a good move. We'll support those women. The single parent incentive, childcare subsidies. Productivity is key to Australia's future. We have to increase productivity, and to see greater participation by women in the workforce is an important part of that productivity measure.
Elizabeth Gaines and Kate West, great to have both of your insights here from Perth. And Kath, it's back to you in the studio.
Thanks so much, Rachel. Well, on that very issue of productivity, Ian, the Treasurer says that this budget strikes the right balance between dealing with the immediate challenges and setting Australia up for the future. But is this a budget that grows the pie? Does it go towards productivity measures?
There's nothing really in the budget that specifically mentions productivity or really tries to fix the productivity problem. And look, no one has the answers to this. I mean, it's a worldwide problem. I know Australia is actually lagging the rest of the developed world. What do you do about it, though? I mean, do you start at the education system, perhaps, and make sure that, instead of lagging the world and dropping behind in education, we make sure that we're churning out kids who actually can fit into a modern world?
Well, Lachlan, the Productivity Commission has a 1,000-page document with over 50 recommendations. Were any of those punctuated throughout this budget?
Yeah, so nothing new in the budget itself. We know they've picked up a couple of them through things like the migration review previously, through temporary skill migration and things like that. And they've made some good noises around, competition reform and that kind of thing. There was nothing new that we saw in this budget that would give us, heart around the productivity problem we're facing. And actually, a lot of the assumptions that they changed in the previous budget highlighted the problem that we face, and we're still silent on how we're going to fix that.
Jo, it's obviously a business program. We want to see what's in this for business. We know that there were some measures announced around energy incentives, energy price relief, instant asset write-off. How much are those measures in the grand scheme of things for business? I mean, are businesses won here, or have they been a little forgotten?
The focus really has been on the household, which is facing just such extreme cost of living pressures. If we think about small businesses, though, they're a bit similar to a household. Well, you know, they often use their home, for example, as collateral. They often operate like a household. Now, there are some measures for electrification and for energy bill relief, but they're relatively small. They'll help some of those energy-intensive small businesses if you think about things like dry cleaners or some cafes, for example. And then the accelerated depreciation has been extended for small businesses, but cut back to $20,000. So it's not going to be about utes. It's going to be about small bits of equipment and appliances. If you come back to the productivity argument, small business is the largest employer in the country. It is an engine of growth, and I would think it's one where it's relatively easier to get some productivity enhancement through than some of those sort of bigger industries that have more complex problems. So I think it's a little disappointing.
If there was one thing that you could do to fix productivity or improve it, though, what would it be?
Oh, look, there's a whole range of things, but the one I always call out is red tape and regulation. I would think that every level of government, federal, state, local, and every business in the country and every individual in the country could change one thing tomorrow to be just a little bit more productive. Now, we do talk about it often in terms of government policy, but there's actually a lot that we as individuals and as businesses can do too.
Lachlan, I'm sure you've got a view of productivity measures too.
It's budget night. We all get very excited about budget. I know I am.
Economists do.
And we sometimes forget that budget isn't the only decision-making tool of governments. And so we've seen governments, I gave them credit before for some good noises about competition, but they've also made some, concerning noises for productivity in small business in the IR space, for example. And so we just need to be conscious of that and think about, what impact that can have for the small businesses who the new, multi-employer bargaining agreements apply to, and what impact that could have on productivity.
Well, sticking on small businesses, and as we've been discussing, developing new clean energy is a key part of this budget. Let's head now to Alicia Barry at a world-first biorefinery in Sydney's West. I believe Alicia's there. Hi, Alicia.
Hey, Kath. Yeah, I'm here in Smithfield in the middle of Sydney's western suburbs where this e-waste miner has just begun producing low-carbon gold, which it plans to sell back to electronics manufacturers. Mint Innovation is planning to get through around 4,000 tonnes of e-waste this year and create around 500 kilograms of gold. Now, I am with founder and CEO of Mint Innovation, Will Barker. Now, the policy settings have been favourable for you so far. You were a recipient of a $4.2 million government grant. What did you make of the Treasurer's speech tonight?
Yeah, really interesting, and I think overall positive. There's some strong stuff, strong investment for advanced manufacturing, and probably more importantly, support for a lower carbon future.
And as for the advanced manufacturing, the National Reconstruction Fund was talked about again, $15 billion. You're looking at replicating these plants overseas. How does that incentive compare with overseas counterparts?
Yeah, it's reasonably favourable. I mean, there's a very strong pull for technologies like these, for onshoring, low carbon technologies into the States, into Europe. But now with the Reconstruction Fund, I think, very, very interesting to pull technologies like this into Australia.
And in terms of the hydrogen announcement, you run on electricity in this plant, and your face did light up when the hydrogen announcement was made. Why was that? Australia doesn't use a lot of renewable, doesn't produce a lot of renewable power or energy, and so anything that promotes that is got to be good for everybody in Australia, but particularly business who are looking to produce low carbon products like us. And very briefly, like many small businesses, the tight labour market has been a challenge for you. Anything in this budget that might make it easier, do you think?
Yeah, look, the tight labour market is a big challenge for, I think, all manufacturers. One of the key differentiators for low carbon businesses means that kind of the youthful part of the market is really looking to join us with part of a revolution addressing climate change, and so it's partly we build it and they'll come, so it works out okay for us.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for your time, Will Barker there. And back to you in the studio, Kath.
Thanks, Alicia. Finally, in the time that we've got left, Joe, the medium-term outlook has improved markedly. There are, though, underlying assumptions there. Can it be achieved?
Look, it is a big improvement. We've now got deficits of just 0.2% of GDP out in the mid-2030s. They depend on the reining in of the NDIS, but also underpinning that, a very high productivity assumption. The budget assumes 1.2% productivity growth, and that's the 20-year average. We haven't seen that in years. In fact, productivity growth at the moment's flat, and as we've talked about, there isn't much in the budget to ramp that up. So it is a risk going forward, and we need to remember that over time, you should have a mixture of surpluses and deficits. The economy is as strong as it's been in 50 years, and the best we've got is a surplus of 0.2% of GDP. So there's still a big structural issue to overcome.
And Lachlan, what areas of reform might you like to see that might go partway to addressing some of these issues?
Yeah, so we've already talked about productivity reform, but the other driver of the change in the medium term in the 2030s is an increasing over time tax to GDP ratio. And so that increases above 24 to 24.5 by the mid-2030s. And that's something that isn't mentioned in the budget, and we haven't really had a national conversation about how much tax we want to raise and how we want to raise it, because at the moment we're doing it by stealth. We're doing it through bracket creep, and that's not the most efficient way to do that. So we need to have a bit of a conversation about how we want to raise taxes in our society.
I mean, we have seen some changes, albeit quite small, particularly with the PRRT. The government would consider that to be tax reform.
Sure, but what we've got in this country is a structural deficit. So we spend more than we bring in. And that's the result of continually giving out tax relief, long-term tax relief based on short-term revenue surges from commodity booms. And so the PRRT, I think this was a golden opportunity that's been wasted. They could have really done a lot more than just bring in $2.4 billion over the next 4 years. I mean, we are now taxing our resources companies, particularly gas companies, at way below what Qatar, Norway, the UK does. And this was the chance to do it.
Well, I'm afraid we're out of time. Thank you all so much for your analysis on Budget 2023. And that ends tonight's coverage. Thank you so much to my panel, Ian Verinder, Joe Masters and Lachlan Bass. We will have more details of the latest measures for business, big and small, in the coming days. I'm Catherine Robinson. Thanks for your company tonight, and I'll see you next time. Goodbye.